And we're live. Anthony, I've been at Loughcrew, Newgrange, the Hill of Tara, a handful of other different places recently, and I can't help but notice signs all over the place saying strictly no drones. And I also can't help but feel that you had something to do with that. Are you to blame, Mr. Murphy?
As much as it would probably give me a lot of street cred to say yes. In fact, no. I believe that the decision to disallow the flying of drones at historic monuments is more to do with one or two crazy idiots who decided to do stupid things, such as fly their drone through the window of a castle and missing the window and getting the drone lodged in the wall of a castle instead, resulting in an expensive removal procedure and the hiring of an expert to see what damage was done to the castle. So definitely nothing to do with me. I swear.
The reason that I asked is because I think is it right in saying that you've coined the new term, Dronehenge? Is it fair to say that's a new term coined by yourself? Or?
No, that's not fair. No, in fact, within a couple of days of the discovery of the new henge at Newgrange by myself and Ken Williams, the media had started to call it Dronehenge. Actually, believe it or not, I mean, the tabloid media are great at coining phrases and headlines, but I have a cutting from that time from Der Spiegel, which is a German publication, and their headline was Dronehenge, and that was like a couple of days after the discovery. The media started calling it Dronehenge because it sounds like Stonehenge. It probably resembles Stonehenge to some extent, but it was discovered with a drone. So,
can you tell me about that? Because all I remember, I was on Facebook whenever it was a year and a half or 2 years ago, and something came up from your Mythical Ireland page, and I was like, "What's this?" And my knee-jerk reaction was that you had discovered some sort of huge, big henge right next door to Newgrange, but that obviously wasn't the case because anything within a mile of Newgrange has already been discovered, clearly. So that was my initial thought process. But alas, you did discover an enormous, what is a henge? To start off, sorry, I'm overwhelmed with questions here to ask you about it because I want to know how, when, who, what.
You said
when,
alas in there. It's like, no, it's not alas. It's quite the opposite. It's quite a happy story. But yeah, I mean, I've repeatedly said that since the discovery that I would have said beforehand that everything that was there at Brunabonia, it being a World Heritage Site, some of the largest and grandest monuments in Europe, having been excavated, Newgrange and Nowth, with all of the attention of the world's archaeologists on it over the past 4 or 5 decades, I would have said, yeah, like yourself, I would have said everything significant that's there has been discovered. Absolutely. I would have said there's no chance of finding anything. And in fact, at the time I was flying the drone during the drought, I was looking for pre-existing features, but new detail in the existing monuments.
Yeah, so a scrap of something that hadn't been noticed before.
Exactly. I had no anticipation of just making any major discovery, but boy, was I wrong.
The picture, which I must actually upload along with this episode, it's fantastic. But I presume the picture that made all the papers and that does the rounds and is in your new book that you're very generously giving me, Dronehenge. Available on your website, I believe.
Correct. Yes, signed by the author, mythicalireland.com. Go into the store and the bookshop.
Perfect.
Thanks for the plug.
No, my absolute
appreciate it. We're only 3 minutes in and we already got a plug in. That's great.
The first of many. It's not your only book. We'll squeeze them in. We'll squeeze them in. But yeah, so presumably so the drone, which is like forgive the terminology, but a tiny helicopter, say.
Yeah,
so like almost like a toy helicopter. It goes up. You have a controller in your hand. Presumably you have a screen on your controller so you can see live from the drone. So the drone is up practically in the clouds looking down in the landscape. and you have the
If it's in the
screen.
clouds, you've lost
Well,
it.
it's up there. You're down there. You have it in your hand in front of you. It's
Yeah.
basically like, does your phone clip into it?
Correct.
Or, okay.
A lot of drones, most of them, some of them have integrated screens, but a lot of them you attach a smartphone or an iPad or a tablet.
Yes.
And so it's basically a glorified remote controller with buttons and two joysticks on it.
Yes.
The joysticks controlling various movements of the craft. But you're exactly right. The drone has a camera attached to it, and it sends a live feed, which you're watching on your smartphone screen or your iPad screen, whatever you happen to be using.
Okay, so when you first thought you maybe kind of saw something on the screen, was it as obvious as the photos that we see now in the pictures,
No.
or did you have to get that at a certain time of day with a certain light and whatever else?
No, as it happens, the light on the evening in question, which was Tuesday, the 10th of July, 2018, at 8:47 p.m. I mean, I'll never forget it. It's an unforgettable experience, but the light was pretty good. The thing is that when you're using, and I was using a smartphone very similar to this, just a tiny bit smaller than this, so quite a small screen, that the detail you can see, obviously when you bring home your drone and you put the card into the computer and you look at these images and video on a big monitor,
Yes.
you see it in proper detail. You don't see the same amount of detail, but certainly, I mean, as soon as I saw it, I knew straight away there's a circle there in the field that is not on any map and we've never seen before. I mean, that moment was just, I describe it in the book in minute detail. Actually, it's like you're able to stretch out time, and those first few moments after you've seen it, your mind is actually saying to you, it's trying to rationalize what you're seeing. And among the rationalizations that I made were, and I'm talking like seconds after I first saw it, my brain is telling me, that looks like a tractor has driven around the field in a circle. But because there were these, what would we call them? What looked like ruts, twin pairs of grooves. I thought maybe he'd been revving up and leaving these tire marks. Somebody had a bit of fun in the field with a tractor. And then I was thinking, maybe there was a big circus down there and there was a big tent set up, because that's kind of what it looked like, almost like the imprint of a big top,
Yeah, yeah.
And these are the things I was trying to say to myself. And then, like 10, 15 seconds after seeing it, when I'm flying the drone towards it, and I've let out this famous exclamation, "What the hell is that?" And I don't know whether it could have been hell or another word, another four-letter word, What the is that? And about 15, 20 seconds after first seeing it, I think that's when it started to sink in. No, Anthony, you're seeing a henge. Or I say it in the book that just very quickly in your head, you're going through the scenarios. You're saying, okay, it's not tractor tire marks because it's a standing crop. It's a field with a crop in it.
Yes.
It's not a field that has been ploughed. You're not looking at soil here. You're looking at crops. So this is a crop mark. You're ruling out the possibility that it's what we call a crop circle. You get a lot of those in Britain. Modern day pranksters, basically artists who go out into fields of crops in the summertime and stamp down the crop and create these very ornate geometric patterns. And also, you're ruling out what's the likelihood that there was a big top in a field near Newgrange where, and I just said, look, you have to be realistic here, Anthony. This looks like a crop mark of a giant monument. And if it is a giant monument, it can only be one monument, and that is a henge, or some form of giant enclosure. There's, it's very difficult because you don't know, but you just know, as I say, in that first 30 seconds, I reckon, by the time 30 seconds had elapsed, somewhere in my brain, somebody was pulling out files. The little mouse was running around all the filing cabinets, was pulling out files going, what does this look like? What does this look like? And he's going, yeah, he finds the drawer labelled henge. And he pulls out all the drawings and photographs of different henges in Brunabonia and in other parts of Ireland and in other parts of Britain. And he's going, yep, that's a match. It's a henge.
And presumably you must have thought that you've rediscovered something, or were you familiar enough with
No,
the area to know that this?
I was
definitely
familiar enough
happened
with the area. Yeah.
Okay.
I was familiar enough with the area. You get to know after a while. You've seen all the maps in the archaeology books. You know all the labelled sites. Now, there was a project, the Boyne Valley Landscapes Project, as part of Instar, which had produced a very big report in 2010 that I was very familiar with. And they had found loads of stuff that had been basically hidden beneath the surface and hadn't been mapped before. Found loads of monuments and potential monuments.
And sorry to cut across, but how did they find these? Was it with drones, or was it with LiDAR? Or
Different techniques, but LiDAR was a big part of identifying some of them. Actually, there's another henge to the west of Dronehenge that was found by the Instar group, by the Boyne Valley Landscapes Project. And they call that LP2, which means low profile site 2. They found what looked like an imprint or a remnant of a mound surrounded by a ring. And so they went and investigated with geophysics and found, it's some sort of a mound with a broken or a dashed enclosure around it. A little bit like Dronehenge, but not as ornate. But I knew from the Instar and all the other publications about Brunebonia that in this part of the field where I was seeing this giant circle, there definitely wasn't anything. The only thing that there was a linear bank that, it's a strange one. It's like a straight linear bank about 200 meters long that happens to coincide with the site of Dronehenge, but we don't know what that is. But no indication in Instar of anything
right
as spectacular, you know.
When you gave me it was a LP2 for the thing you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
That's obviously the official categorization of that.
Yeah.
The catalogue number, say. What's the catalogue for what we're calling Dronehenge? Have they officially named it,
No.
LP3 or whatever it is?
No.
It hasn't been. Has it been officially recognised?
Oh, yes, yeah. Oh, yeah, it's been recorded in the National Monuments Database. The henge to the east, there's 3 in a row. The henge to the east is an embanked henge, so we've known about that for decades because it's quite obvious.
Like a ripple in the landscape you can see.
Yeah, a big ring that you can see, and especially in aerial photographs. Site P, they call that. And at one point, Steve Davis, who's in UCD, is an archaeologist, friend of mine, who's kind of partly responsible for the discovery of Dronehenge because he encouraged me to fly over Site P during the drought, and that was one of the reasons I was out with the drone that evening. But he said that if he was going to label it, he'd call it Site P1. And I was like, no, we have to be a little bit more imaginative. And then National Monuments Service did their report. They sent a helicopter up. They did several helicopter flights over the landscape and took lots of photographs and produced an interim report on winter solstice, so 5 or so months after the discovery. And in their report, they call it the geometric henge.
The geometric henge, right?
Yeah. So all things considered, if you'd ask me what would I like to call it, I'd like to call it New Henge because it's in the townland of Newgrange. And it's close to Newgrange, and it's a new undiscovered. But the media kind of took over, and the name Dronehenge kind of stuck, so that's the name I kind of use now.
Yeah,
but I'd much prefer that to Site P1, to be honest.
Yeah. Has more of a ring to it, all right.
Yeah.
When you said your suggestion might be New Henge, how old is it? Or do we know?
Well, we don't know is the answer. And in fact, when you get a chance to read the Dronehenge book, you'll get into the frustration of the scenario around henges in Ireland. There is so little excavation of henges that almost everything we know about henges is based upon information gleaned from archaeological investigation of henges in Britain.
Okay.
Believe it or not.
And presumably a long time ago or recently.
Well, I mean, over the last probably half century or so.
But you see, there's something, and then maybe this is just an unfair bias opinion that I have, but I tend to think of most archaeology that was done, and this is probably completely unfair, but it's just what's in my head. I have it that 50 plus years ago, it was as much kind of grave robbing and treasure hunting as it was real archaeological research, say, like of the caliber that will be done now. Like if something was to be excavated now, I can imagine the site being completely plotted, mapped out, everything categorized, everything,
think
T's
you'd have to
crossed,
go
I's dotted.
further back than 50 years for the type of archaeology you're talking about.
Okay.
I mean, you see a lot of that in the 19th century and perhaps in the early 20th century. But like the excavations at Newgrange and Nouth were highly professional.
And they would have been done when, roughly?
Well,
Even?
they both actually began in the same year, in 1962.
Okay.
So, no, you'd have to go a little bit further back for the sort of more sort of grave robbing type, you know.
The more cavalier approach.
Cavalier is a good word. Antiquarians who were basically looking for treasure more so than, and not really systematically recording what they were finding as they were digging down. Like Douth, for instance. Douth was kind of wrecked by an excavation at the time of the famine, actually, in the late 1840s. And they abandoned it after 2 seasons because they basically didn't find anything that they considered of worth.
Yes.
And left a big crater in it, you know. So that's the sort of cavalier approach that was taken, you know, in the old days, as it were.
Yes.
But we have a real problem with henges because we have so little to go on. There was one henge at Monk Newtown, a little bit to the north of Newgrange, perhaps a mile or so north of Newgrange, that was excavated in the 70s because there was a building going onto it, and it was what we call a rescue excavation. But aside from that, I mean, there's probably a dozen henges at Brunibonia, which is the highest concentration anywhere in the world, by the way, of henge monuments. Nowhere else is as many henges as Brunibonia. And we can't say anything for certain about any of them because we haven't done any digging. We're assuming for now that Dronehenge is late Neolithic, which would put it sort of in the time frame approximately 2900 BC to about 2500, 2400 BC. So you're looking at something that's potentially 4,400 to 4,900 years old. Right. So when I say to you that within 30 seconds of discovering it, I'm saying to myself, the little mouse in the filing cabinets in the head, in my brain, has made a match. That at that moment you're realising something, that this is no ordinary ring fort. Ring forts, we have at least 40,000 ring forts. I discovered one, by the way, in August last month.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, at Fenor, between Rossnaree and Slane, south of the Boyne. And it's impressive enough. It's 45 or 50 metres across and all the rest. But they are medieval sort of embanked farmsteads or homesteads. And they're a dime a dozen. When you find a Neolithic henge in the middle, like 750 metres from Newgrange, smack bang in the middle of one of the world's most studied archaeological landscapes, you know, I think the gravity of it hit home very quickly for me, the significance of it. It's like all your dreams come true. It's better than winning the lottery, you know?
And it begs the question, what else is left to be discovered there? And presumably that henge isn't, you know, the last thing to be discovered in the area.
No, and of course you definitely can't rule out the possibility of further discoveries. In fact, we had a drought this spring, and I took the drone out and did quite a lot of aerial surveying of the fields at Newgrange Farm. The grass fields this spring were parched and were showing features, and I reckon that there's at least a few more monuments or archaeological features there that aren't on any of the maps in that imagery. But as time goes on, we are definitely reducing the likelihood of further discoveries. Like Steve Davis with the Romano-German Commission, I think they're called, has been doing what we call, well, it's geophysics, but it's like large-scale geophysics. In the old days, you used to walk around with implements and walk across fields taking measurements. Now you can put this equipment onto a trailer and tow it around a field with a jeep, right?
Yes.
So you can do it. You can cover a lot bigger areas quicker. And he has discovered quite a lot of stuff, actually. I think 40 monuments in the past couple of years.
Wow.
A lot of that is medieval stuff.
And sorry, you said medieval a couple of times. When was that in the timeline for people?
Well, just early medieval would be basically from around the time of the beginning of the arrival of Christianity,
To, sorry, the
Fifth-
world or Ireland?
To
Or, sorry,
Ireland. No, world. I'm just talking about Ireland here.
Okay.
So 5th century AD to the arrival of the Normans.
Okay.
So 12th century, 1168, 69 for the arrival of the Normans. Can't remember offhand. It's either 68 or 69. Dermot McMurrough and all that. But that's the early medieval. Now, look, don't get me wrong. I'm not belittling or reducing the importance of that, because I love archaeology, full stop, and I'm fascinated. I have found, using Google Maps and or Google Earth and Apple Maps, I have found around 300 monuments from the imagery that was taken during the time of the 2018 drought, and a great deal of that will be medieval stuff. So I'm not dissing that in any way, but it's like, you know, the first of all my discoveries was the biggest by far, was Dronehenge. Dronehenge is bigger. I mean, it's over 500 feet in diameter. It's likely to have been a massive monument when it was standing, made mostly of timber. It's close to Newgrange. It's part of a complex of monuments, and we found other stuff, myself and Ken Williams, which led to even further discoveries. And so when you discover a medieval ring fort, you know, afterwards,
it's all downhill from there.
You know, it just doesn't have the same impact, you know.
Yes.
Something about Dronehenge that captured the world's imagination. And I think, being a journalist, and I understand the value of it, I think that the big thing for people was that the pictures, they could just see looking at the pictures how truly gigantic this thing was. They didn't need it to be explained.
Yeah, there's an obviousness to it.
You hear a lot, you see it quite a lot. I mean, one of the things that gets shared a lot on social media are stories about archaeological discoveries. But sometimes you see stories about discoveries, but you don't see a picture of what's been discovered, or you don't see a picture that does it justice. And so you're left with the text trying to fill in the gaps for you. With Dronehenge, the wonderful thing was that the pictures got shared around. Little did I know on that evening, Tuesday the 10th of July 2018, little did I know that the pictures I was taking with the drone that evening, some of them would be seen by hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah,
and I'm not joking about that.
Yeah.
I'm deadly serious about that. The impact of that, I think, was they were able to immediately see with their own eyes, wow, look at the size of that motherfucker, you know. Look at this, you know. It was truly enormous. And that was one of the impressive things for me, was how does something that big hide from all the prying eyes who've been watching this landscape for the past 5 or 6 decades? How does it hide in plain view? And the reason for that, of course, is explained in the book, available on mythicalireland.com. Sorry. The reason for that is because it was a timber structure, and because some of the features are ditches, things that were dug into the ground. Basically, it rotted away and filled up. And over time, the land was ploughed, and there's just no visible surface trace of it. And yet, the detail that's viewable in the drought imagery, the fascinating thing about that, and I was explaining it at the time, and I still can't get over it, it's like a mirage, you know, is that the archaeological features that you're seeing are several feet beneath the surface. But the image that you're seeing is on the top of a crop that's maybe 4 or 5 feet high. So you're seeing a magical sort of ghostly image. Richard Moore calls it a hologram. You're seeing a hologram. You're seeing an image on the surface of a crop that's standing 4 or 5 feet high. But that's an image of something that's beneath the ground.
Yeah, it's betraying what's beneath it.
And when the crop was harvested, of course, the whole thing vanishes.
Just disappears.
And there's just no visible sign of it on the surface. It's fascinating.
Oh, incredibly so.
Gripping, you know. It is the makings of a Dan Brown novel, you know.
On the modern, or the more modern techniques you mentioned before, you went round with basically a meter stick and you took your plots and whatever else. Now you're dragging very sensitive equipment behind a tractor or a Jeep or whatever it is. I saw within the last couple of years LiDAR images taken in South America somewhere, and they were basically looking beneath the forest of what was once there. Has that kind of technology, like, has all the latest subterranean imagery technology, has that come to Newgrange and throughout Ireland, or are we still waiting to get
pretty
that?
Much. Actually, believe it or not, the Instar, and if I'm wrong about this, that's my mistake, but I picked this up lately, and I think I'm right, that the Instar Boyne Landscapes project was a sort of a pioneering project in that they were using LiDAR before it was used in any sort of a widespread way in Ireland. Now, the imagery from that time is quite low resolution. We have better resolution capabilities now than we did then.
Yes.
Same with cameras. You know, you get 50 megapixel cameras now. Back then you were 12 and 15 megapixels.
Yeah, and that was amazing at the time.
You know, yeah, exactly. But the only other sort of really advanced project that I can, now there may be others, of course, the only one that I can remember is the Discovery Programme at Tara, which found another similar henge-like enclosure at Tara that hadn't been known about before. And actually I have a picture of that in my book Island of the Setting Sun. So like this was an age where, I mean, when I say this, the past couple of decades was an age where we were moving away from these large scale excavations like Nowth and Newgrange, and we're moving into more advanced technology. We're looking at archaeology in ways we've never done before, which don't involve us digging the ground.
Yes.
And it's incredible. And it turns out that what we call the citizen archaeologist, in other words, a guy like me who's no qualifications in archaeology, but is interested in archaeology and history in the past, flies a drone and makes a major discovery. That citizen archaeologists are now able to make a contribution. And not just a contribution, I mean actually a significant contribution to our understanding of the past. And that's lovely. It's like the technology is not restricted, because you can buy the drone that I discovered. I still have it. I won't sell it.
Of course, yeah.
I don't use it anymore, but it's a Phantom 3 Advanced. I bought it off a former colleague of mine, a photographer, for €470 second hand. Now that, for some people, is a big outlay, but for a lot of people is like nothing. This is not, like a generation ago, if you wanted to take aerial photographs of Brunibonia, you had to hire a helicopter or an airplane.
Oh yeah, charter a flight, yeah.
Right? And I don't know how much that costs, but
a lot
I can
more
imagine,
than 400 and something.
yeah,
euro.
I can imagine it's like €1,000 an hour or whatever. And you know, I don't know. Drones are just the most extraordinary thing, and there is definitely the capability for a lot more discovery. And the reason for that, Fran, is very simple. I discovered a ring fort at Fenor on the bank holiday weekend at the beginning of August. I took the drone out about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, to have a look at the same field again, and the crop had been harvested, and there's absolutely no sign of that monument. So what I'm saying is there could be monuments there, and there definitely are, actually. It's not that there could be, there definitely
without
are.
question,
All
yeah.
over Ireland, there are monuments waiting to be discovered. And if a drone pilot happens to be in an area at the right time, they will discover something. And if they go again 6 weeks or 2 months or 6 months later, they'll see no sign of it. There's a serendipity involved. But what I've realized is what's important for me, and if you ask me like what my role is in all this, apart from being the discoverer, is I believe that part of my role is, because I'm convenient to Brunibonia, part of my role would be, well, I'm going to keep monitoring Brunibonia. I'm going to keep flying the drone over the fields, because you know, who knows what's going to turn up. You know?
Absolutely, and I think you're a beacon of light to everyone out there who has an interest in not, you know, ancient monuments, but whatever it is. I mean, I think only a couple of years ago, you're a keen astronomer as well, so you probably know the details of this more than I will. But did some amateur Irish astronomer video a comet crashing into Jupiter? Was that in the last couple of years? Do you remember that? I might be misremembering that myself. But I thought he was
quite possibly, yes, because there are certain amateurs who have invested a lot of time and effort and money into their observatories and have very, very decent capabilities. I know a few of them actually. Just don't specifically remember the details of that, but that absolutely wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
You know?
Yeah, 100%.
And amateurs, again, in the field of astronomy, in the field of amateur radio, which is another of my hobbies, believe it or not, amateurs, non-professionals have been pioneers in some respects. I'm not saying I'm a pioneer of aerial photography or anything, but there have been examples where, ordinary citizens can make significant contributions, and it's lovely. It's really lovely. See, the thing about it is, people forget this, and I don't mind saying this, because you say I'm not part of any organisation. I'm very independent. Irish heritage is ridiculously, grossly underfunded. It's terrible. There's just tourism, loads of money for tourism, but heritage, monuments, very, very little funding. And heritage, as a result, is badly neglected, and it needs that local investment, the local interest. It's the local heritage groups that are doing a lot of the work. I'm not having a go at the Department of Heritage or National Monuments or OPW. They're doing the best that they can in a grossly underfunded situation.
Yes.
But we spoke before you switched on the microphones. You mentioned Lough Crew. You've mentioned it to me a couple of times lately that you'd been up there. Like the Lough Crew monuments are suffering from gross deterioration. Some of the megalithic art is exposed to the elements. Cairntee is locked to the public now because there's some sort of subsidence happening there, and there's no money to address it. That's like, I can say that. Like, if you had a minister on here, they would probably try and deny that, but I can say that.
Yes.
Because if the money was there, they would be addressing it.
That's, I suppose, an added benefit of having kind of independent people who don't do this professionally. They can speak up. They're not afraid of, losing their job, or not even losing their job, but just people are afraid of putting their head above the parapet, but you don't have those kind of concerns. So you can basically tell the truth.
And I wrote a blog post lately about vandalism to ancient sites, which unfortunately is an issue. And one of the things I said in that blog post was that we have a crazy situation where we have heritage and environment in the same department. The same department that is responsible for a lot of large infrastructure projects is also the same department that looks after heritage. Like, talk about a conflict of interests.
Yeah.
It's like, you knew from Celtic Tiger era Ireland that we just decided that archaeology was just this thing you did to find out about something before you destroyed it by building a motorway over it. Essentially,
yeah.
I hate to be flippant about it, but that's the fact of the matter.
Yeah.
We decided that archaeologists were these people who told you, yeah, this is a fascinating site before you ploughed over it.
Yeah, we'll document that, so it's never be forgotten about.
Yeah, exactly. Preservation by record is what they call it.
Oh,
they've
lovely.
actually got a term for it. Preservation by record. We record it and then we destroy it. And the word preservation is ridiculous. It's like, it's a nonsensical word. You're not preserving anything. You're preserving it as a memory, But there would be, I didn't actually, it wasn't my intention to come here and I don't like stoking controversy. Actually, it's just something I try to stick away from generally.
Yeah.
Mythical Ireland is generally a non-religious and non-political organisation. It's not really an organisation. It's a one-man organisation. I try not to get political and I try not to get religious. But by God, sometimes it's hard not to get political.
Yeah,
when you see some of the stuff that happens, So, yeah, I would have to say that I think we have paid a very big price in terms of the stuff that we've lost. And that danger is ever present because a lot of monuments don't have any statutory protection. They're recorded, but they don't have sufficient statutory protection, which has resulted in a lot of cases around the country, that some of them high-profile cases, where landowners went out and basically destroyed monuments because they were in the way of their activities.
But no harm because they've been preserved, in air quotes.
Well, in some cases there wasn't even any archaeology. They just went out and bulldozed them,
Of course.
Now, of course, look, I'm not saying that's going to happen here locally. And I know, actually, for instance, in the Boyne Valley, I happen to know a number of landowners in the area, and they are very, very proud custodians of the heritage and the monuments. So I don't that's not a concern. But, you know, there's another attitude that we have so many monuments that, sure, look, you know.
What's another monument kind of thing?
Yeah. And like, if you allow that attitude to prevail, you'll eventually get to a generation that'll say, geez, you know, it's not that long since we had, you know, 1,000 of these monuments, and now we've only got 300. And eventually it'll reach the stage where there's only a dozen left of a particular type of monument. You know, you can be blasé about it. The other side of it is that you have to be realistic too, which is we have to farm the land. You know, you're in the business of, you know, producing food.
I can safely say I haven't moved a monument in order to let my business thrive, thankfully.
But we have to, you know, the land, you know, we have to obviously plough the land, we have to grow crops, we have to feed our cattle and grow food. Of course we have, you know, so you have that as well. We also have to live somewhere and build homes. Yeah, I understand that. But there are just some things that you cannot replace.
No, without a doubt.
You
And
know.
it's funny because it came up in a recent conversation I had with somebody on the podcast. I think it was in relation to our wildlife. And I made the point that it's great for me. I live in Kilberry, real fertile land, and I'd be out watching the buzzards, and we have foxes and badgers and rabbits, and it's great. It's fantastic. But 50 years ago, we would have had
Corncrakes, maybe.
corncrakes. We would have had half a dozen.
Curlews.
Exactly. We would have had. I can't even name the things that we don't have, obviously. And I'm afraid that my son's going to grow up and he's going to say, "Isn't it great that we have rabbits and foxes?" No mention of the buzzards and the badgers. And then his kids will grow up going, "Jeez, isn't it great that we have rabbits and rats and cockroaches?"
I fully expect at that stage that the rats will have taken over the world.
They haven't
Because the
already.
humans will probably have destroyed it, you know.
Yeah, exactly. But it's the same thing. Like you grow up with this understanding that what you have is there and it's great. But then with every successive generation, it just gets a little bit lower and lower and lower until you realize that, you know, you don't have a heritage or you don't have a ecosystem.
Yeah, it's the same. I think we're treating wildlife the same way we're treating monuments to an extent, you know. It's like everything. We've just we're in a scenario now where so many people are in offices and, you know, not attached to nature, that the only nature they ever see is on screens, you know.
Yeah, very much so.
They don't realize that they're actually losing wildlife and nature to, you know, what we call progress, but of course it's not progress at all. We're not progressing if we're destroying the wildlife and the biodiversity of the earth, and that's another big crisis that we're facing. Into Jesus, I didn't realize we were going to be so hot and heavy.
So soon.
Where's the humor here? Jeez, we're getting. Jesus, this is terrible. Thursday morning, and we're getting. Well, I'm dragging the conversation down, I think.
Well, look, I can pull it back a little because I know that because a lot of people aren't working in Dublin, say, because of the pandemic, a lot of people are working from home, and a lot of people are starting to notice the hedgehog that's on the lawn in the early hours, or do you know that kind of way that people are starting to hear the birds, and they're not commuting as much, so they're home that little bit more. And I think there's been a huge increase, I believe, in seed sales in the likes of Woodies and Choice and different places. So people seem there's a trend there for people growing their own veg and different things. People are starting to get a little bit more clued into it because I think they're just not as much in the rat race as they were.
Yeah, the rat race just takes all of your time.
It really does,
and it just removes your personal investment in these things, because you have to get from A to B to do your job, and from B back to A again in the evening. And by the time you've done all that, you've missed out on all of the wonderful things that are happening out there.
Yeah, without a doubt.
You know, I think this pandemic has done us some favours. It's a rather controversial area of discussion, I suppose, but, you know, and like that, one of the things it has done is it has reduced traffic, and air pollution has vastly reduced the number of planes flying in the sky. Look, we could argue the good and the bad of that. I'm just highlighting that there are silver linings, and like that, I know personally, as a result of the lockdown and the pandemic, I have been able to spend more time out and about, and I have found that to be very valuable, because like that, you just suddenly realise that actually, lads and lassies, there's an awful lot more to life than being in a car and being in an office and zipping up and down the road all day, pretending that in some way this matters.
Yeah, very much so.
You know, because you think it matters to you and it matters to your financial circumstances and keeping a roof over your head. But I think it's times like this that you realise, or you should realise, the things that actually really matter. And it's a funny thing that we've ended up talking about wildlife and monuments, because in my view, we've treated both the same way. It's like heritage is something to be encountered in a virtual sphere.
Yeah, very much so.
And wildlife is the same. We see all these lovely photographs and videos online, and we click like and we share and all the rest.
Yeah.
What effort have we made in our own lives to interact with that nature and to preserve it or protect it in some way? You know?
No,
the answer is we've been dreadfully remiss, actually.
The closest we've come to it is we go to zoos to see animals, and we go to heritage sites to see the plaques that they've erected, instead of actually being part of our own history and our own culture and our own heritage.
Yeah. What's the answer?
Well, I think
that's the big question, isn't it? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think you made a massive stride in what you do generally. I think just with your Mythical Ireland page, you have the Facebook page, the Instagram, the YouTube. You're out there, you're doing it, and you're living your own life. You're not doing it to appease anyone or because there's a need to do it. You're doing it because you want to do it. And I think if more people took a leaf out of your book, or your several books available at good bookshops on mythicalireland.com.
plug number 3.
But you know what I mean? I think that what people need is examples of what to do, as opposed to more so than examples of what we shouldn't do.
I met a guy. I was in Sligo last week. I did a sort of an odyssey, a megalithic adventure last Thursday. I went to try and see as much megalithic archaeology as I could in one day. And when I was at Carrowmore, I was being given the tour there by a very good friend of mine, Martin Byrne, who I've known for years, and he's brilliant. He's a little bit, I just see him as my equivalent on the West Coast, He's just doing what I do and really loving it. But we met a couple there from the north, from Northern Ireland, and eventually we got talking to them, and the gentleman in question was very active in community heritage in the north. And he wasn't very impressed with the authorities and what the authorities were doing. And so when he got talking to Martin and I, he actually said, not that we put the words into his mouth, but he said, "I'm glad to hear you two are sort of mavericks." And I was like, I wouldn't consider myself a maverick. Well, certainly consider myself very independent. But he then said, "How would you see your role?" And I actually took a step back from it. I was like, actually, it's a funny thing that I don't know if I've ever been asked that. What do you see as your role personally, or as Mythical Ireland's role? And when I thought about it for a minute, I said, actually, my role is probably, I'm a popularizer of archaeology and mythology and ancient history. I see my role as popularizing it. So what I do is I read a lot of the books and the archaeological texts and a lot of the myths. And I bring that to the public, I think, in a way that they can understand. I try to translate the more difficult concepts into layman's terms. You see, there's an awful lot of very, very good information buried in academic texts.
No, I believe
that
it,
the general public will never see the light. They'll never see the light of day for most people. And it's the same with the myths. Like, Ireland has a vast corpus or body of mythology and folklore, a huge amount of it. We in the Christian Brothers school in Drogheda, we were taught classical studies, and we were taught that, in a way, the whole light of the world emerged from the classical world. The Greeks and the Romans gave us civilization. It gave us everything we have. And I've realised over the past 20 years that no, in fact, we had at least all of that, if not more. within the borders of our own island, and we just had neglected that. So the role of popularizing it, you're definitely trying to popularize it in a way that brings awareness to it in a constructive way. You're trying to make people aware of the deeper aspect, not just there's a whole load of signposted monuments in Ireland that you can go to. I mean, Brunabonia and the Hill of Tara, for example, in our own area. Yeah, that's great. But what about that ring fort on Farmer Joe's land that his family have some knowledge of, because the grandfather used to say, oh yeah, there's a fort there. And maybe he even remembered the name of it. There was a particular name on that field or on the fort. And they had forgotten all about it, and maybe it had gotten ploughed away over the generations. And suddenly it's visible in an aerial photograph. You know, what you're forgetting about is that at one time, maybe 1,000 years ago, maybe 1,500 years ago, a family lived there and kept cattle there and eked out an existence in a much different time in the world. At a time when there were much different challenges than what we have today. And it's trying to reimagine that. And then the stories of that era, you know, and the change from, you know, when Christianity came in and how much life changed during that time. It's to try and spark the imagination, to get people thinking along those lines. With Dronehenge, what I've tried to do in the book is to try to build a picture as to, well, what the hell did this thing look like? And what was it likely to have been used for? Can we imagine scenarios? And I've painted scenarios in the picture, in the book. I've painted a picture of what I think might have gone on there based on what the archaeologists have told me. And it's just trying to light that spark in people to get them interested enough that we can, you know, retain, preserve, promote. But it is a double-edged sword, because in promoting sites, you bring traffic to them, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And we see that at Lough Crew. Lough Crew is suffering from the fact that people are walking all over these ancient cairns, and, you know, gradually they're eroding and being damaged and all the rest. So it's striking the balance between promoting and preserving.
Yeah, it's funny you say that,
way.
Because we mentioned previously, before the recording started, I had texted you a week or so ago about the possibility of you coming back on again, and you texted me back to say that you were up that mountain that you mentioned a few minutes ago in Sligo, and you were examining, what was the name of the cairn again?
Was I up at the... Oh, I was up on Knocknaray, Queen Maeve's cairn.
Yes, where you said Queen Maeve is said to have been buried. And I looked it up then on Wikipedia, and I saw that it was the largest cairn outside of the Boyne Valley.
Yeah.
And that it was supposed to hold the remains of Maeve from Irish mythology. And the alarming thing for me was that it was and is unexcavated. And when I said to you before the recording started, it's mad the way that it hasn't been excavated. Why hasn't it? And you raised a very good point, insofar as that we shouldn't be going around opening up all of these things. And the example I think you gave was, or one of them was, what was taken out of Newgrange that was there for nearly 5,000 years is now in a storage cabinet in Swords somewhere.
Yeah.
And where will it be in another 5,000 years? I wouldn't think it'll be in that same storage cabinet. So there's an element of damage that has to be done to these places to excavate them in the first place. But is there a halfway point between maybe not fully excavating them, maybe examining them, especially now with LiDAR and different technologies? Is there a halfway point between fully excavating them and completely ignoring them?
Yeah, there definitely is. It's actually that's a very good question. There definitely is. In answer to, I suppose I'll deal with that if I can in two sections. The first dealing with archaeology, and the second dealing with non-invasive techniques. The archaeology to this point, I mean, in the past 50 years or 60 years, we've been doing, in the past century, we've been doing a lot of excavation. I wonder, can we truthfully, honestly say that modern archaeological excavation isn't just a new form of treasure hunting and grave robbing?
Yeah, well, I suppose back in the day, you were looking for something that could be melted down and sold, and now it's put on display and you charge people to come and see it. They're not the exact same.
Well,
but...
I just wonder about the fact that we now, in the past couple of centuries especially, that we have suddenly deemed it okay to dig open what is basically a grave site. Passage tombs and megalithic monuments are generally burial places, and to clear them out and to sterilize them of all their buried remains, the bones and the cremated bones and fragments that we find, and to cart them off and put them in boxes and keep them in storage. As I said, most of them are in storage in a warehouse in Swords in County Dublin. Are we sure? Are we full sure that we've moved on from being grave robbers and treasure hunters?
Yeah,
because I'm not so sure that we have.
Yeah,
and I know lots of archaeologists, and I know that, it'll probably work them up a little bit to hear this, but we can't say that we're sure. What is it that has possessed us in recent history to want to dig up graves that previously we were like, no, that's taboo. You don't dig up graves. You leave them. You have respect for prehistoric burial places that have been there for centuries and millennia. You don't touch them. You stand off from them. You don't walk on them. You don't allow your cattle to graze on them. And you certainly don't go in and dig them with trowels and shovels.
Yeah, and put them into little sterilized boxes and categorize them.
We've taken like the fascinating study of the bones recently at Newgrange. And remind me, we have to get back to non-invasive. The fascinating study recently of the DNA of the guy that we call NG10, which is the only uncremated remains that were found at Newgrange during O'Kelly's excavations, were these petrous temporal bones, which is apparently some of the hardest and densest bone in the human body, part of the skull, I think behind the ears. They were able to extract a DNA sample and sequence his genome, and it turns out his parents were first degree relatives. In other words, his parents were either brother and sister, or
father and daughter,
mother son, which I think might possibly tell us a lot about the structure of society at that time. But it's even the fact that those bones were in the earth in the chamber of Newgrange until the 1960s, and they're now not there anymore.
Yes,
I think tells us quite a lot about our own. I mean, you could go down a Carl Jung sized rabbit hole.
Go for it.
You could, and you could say, perhaps the digging that we do into ancient grave sites is an avoidance technique. We're avoiding digging into the archaeology of our own psyche and our own unconscious, and we're avoiding all of the questions about ourselves, which is the most urgent journey that Jung believed we needed to go on in this modern era, was, the journey into the self and to examine our own deepest shadows. I mean, the dark parts, of course, especially, that we seem to want to avoid and project onto everyone else. So that's the whole. I mean, I haven't written about this yet, actually, in any of my books.
I like the way you said yet.
But it's something I definitely want to write about. Is the psychology of why are we so fascinated all of a sudden? I mean in the past, certainly in the past century. Why are we so interested now in clearing out grave sites? Like, we wouldn't go into a cemetery with a shovel and dig up a body.
It's funny because when you start...
Well, we do for forensic purposes,
yes,
in certain criminal cases, of course. But we would consider it an absolute act of desecration.
Yes,
to go into a modern cemetery and dig up bones that were buried in the past half century. That would be a national scandal, wouldn't it?
Oh, without a doubt. And
but it's perfectly okay to dig up a medieval grave or a Bronze Age grave or a Neolithic grave.
Now, as you said, that's only
because
they've all been left alone.
They're far enough in the past that we don't consider them closely related to us, so it's okay.
Yeah, it's funny because when you first went down this line of kind of comparing, you're not even comparing. I mean, it's well known that Newgrange was a passage and it was a burial site. But when you start going down that kind of line, I was thinking, but if the Neolithic people who built it, if their descendants were still around, they'd kick up a fuss and wouldn't let you. But I mean, that's me and you, isn't it? And most people listening, we are like, are they? But you see where I'm coming from. Like, you can see in America, the Native Americans will kick up a fuss if anybody went near. Let's say now, obviously wasn't the case back in the day, but now they wouldn't allow. You couldn't be seen to disturb an ancient Indian burial site now. But that's only really because there's still Native Americans
Unless you're
living
building
there.
an oil pipeline
Well,
across
yeah,
it, then it's perfectly
course.
okay.
Yeah, well,
You know, I mean,
in the name of progress.
we're seeing the same theme play out in different parts of the world. But we're not actually related to the people of the Neolithic. That's a whole different discussion.
Ooh.
Most of the modern Irish population is descended from the Beaker Bronze Age culture,
And what happened
which
to
came
the...
immediately after the megalithic building Neolithic culture. It's apparently DNA. They're diverse. They're diverse cultures. The people of the Neolithic were dark-skinned and blue-eyed, which is a very unusual combination. They emanated originally from Anatolia, or the area that we would know as Anatolia in modern-day Turkey, and gradually migrated across the continent of Europe. But the Bronze Age culture is a different culture. Originally originating. Sorry. Come on, Anthony. Yeah, I'm sub-editing my own copy as I'm writing it here. Originating in Iberia and spreading out from Central Europe. It's a different culture with a different genetic makeup, and apparently, in the past decade, modern science has overthrown some of the things that we held on to as fact until DNA proved otherwise. And one of those was that modern Irish people are actually descended from the people who were here before the Neolithic, the Mesolithic, the hunter-gatherers, the Middle Stone Age, as we'd call it. They're the people who arrived after the Ice Age. Around, we see the first evidence of human activity at Mount Sandel in outside Coleraine, on the very northern tip of the island, around 7000 BC. But we're not descended from them at all. And we have actually no right to call the builders of Newgrange our ancestors.
And is there anyone alive today that has that right?
The funny thing is, there's been a long-running question about, well, what happened? We still have to get back to non-invasive archaeology. There's a very interesting question about what happened between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. What happened? Because we know, certainly from studies of the British DNA, because the data set is growing all the time, because the more genomes we decode or sequence, the bigger the data set that we have. In Britain, 90% of the Neolithic DNA was wiped out. Something very substantial happened, and I've discussed it. I'm not an expert, so I've only discussed it in very sort of broad terms. You know, it seems that there wasn't necessarily a catastrophe, as it were, but it's more likely that this new people arrived in the Bronze Age, that they may have killed some of the males and mated with the females. They might have brought diseases with them that the natives, the Neolithic people, weren't able to handle. A little bit like the Europeans brought new diseases to America.
Yeah, they had no immunity, basically.
The natives didn't have immunity to. And there might have been some conflict. And as well as that, I think it's almost I don't think it's in question at this stage, but I couldn't refer you exactly to the sources on it, that the climate deteriorated towards the end of the Neolithic as well. So there were extra challenges there if you were farming and trying to grow your food. You know, that you've got all sorts of problems. You've perhaps got, you know, environmental, you've got climate and weather events working against you. You've got new arrivals coming in, threatening your way of life and perhaps bringing disease with them. So I think there might have been, I'm just describing this now in terms, some of the archaeologists will perhaps have more information to pad this out or to dispute it, but a perfect storm of things happening at that time that allowed this new culture to take root. And we're descended from this new culture that arrived around, we're talking around 2500 BC, so around that 4,500 year ago horizon, which is one of the reasons I'm so interested in the late Neolithic phase at Brú na Bóinne, because it's now apparent to us that that phase was much bigger than we thought it was. There's a huge monument complex there in the late Neolithic. So far from there being a deterioration, it seems just in that period when we were reaching the end of the Neolithic and the arrival of the Bronze Age, we see this vast complex. So that doesn't speak to us of population collapse.
Yeah, on the contrary, it's the peak of civilization almost.
Almost, yeah. You know that they had built these giant stone monuments, and now they were building giant earthen and timber monuments. And clearly, quite clearly, there are huge numbers of people involved in the construction of those, because it's not the sort of thing that 12 lads do of a Saturday afternoon.
Yeah,
in Meath High. You know, this is the sort of thing that requires a huge organisation of labour from probably a good distance away. So I'm that's something I'm interested in, and perhaps I need to. I think it's not perhaps. I definitely do need to do more research. But the DNA has been fascinating. Anyway, so we sidelined a little bit there from the discussion about grave robbing,
yes,
and treasure hunting. How can we be sure that the archaeologists of today aren't just a sort of a qualified, fancy, dressed up version of the Victorian grave robbers of the past and treasure hunters? And my answer to that is I don't think we can be sure at all. We have this absolute fascination with the humans of the past. I don't know if we've convinced ourselves what questions we're trying to answer.
Yeah,
we're far more comfortable looking at people of the past than we are looking at people of the present. Is what
absolutely.
Is how I would put it. It's a far more comfortable thing for us to look at people in the past and point out their deficiencies and the challenges that they had and the things that they did and the problems that they encountered than it is for us to address the problems that we have right now, which are, as you know, very serious, you know. So just to quickly cover the non-invasive, yeah, you asked about Queen Maeve's cairn and it's unexcavated, and you know, are there other ways?
Let's get in there.
Well, there are other ways. Actually, at Millmount in Drogheda, there was a program of non-invasive archaeology called MARS, Millmount Archaeological Remote Sensing. And it was MARS for short in the past decade. That was looking to see Millmount is a martello. You'll know it. Everybody, even if you've only ever been to Drogheda once, you'll know it. It's this martello tower sitting on a big mound overlooking the town.
Yeah, no, the one is it a walled tower? It's like it's
so the tower is a martello tower built by the British in the early 19th century, 1808, Richmond Fort. The British Army had been based at that complex. Before that, it was a garrison town, but it was built on top of a mound that was said by the historians to have been built by the Normans, a Norman castle moat, a moat and bailey, right? In perhaps the late 12th century, the early 13th century. But the folklore has always said, no, that's the burial mound of Amergin, the Milesians, who came in to take Ireland from the Tuatha De Danann, right? And the folklore would say that it's part of the Brunabonia complex. The annals say that the cave of the wife of the Gubban at Drogheda was raided by the Vikings, along with the mounds of Newgrange, Nouth and Douth in the 9th century. So you have all this stuff that suggests Millmount is older than the Normans, who are said to have been the ones who built it. What the Normans usually did actually was they found a mound pre-existing. They said, right lads, build a castle on top of that, fortify that. Sure, if you were coming in, you know, as a new people trying to establish yourselves and trying to establish your authority, would you employ labour to build yourself a big mound, or would you just say, there's a mound there, we'll just reinforce that one? Of course you'd reinforce what's there already, you know. Well,
you're taking it from them as well as building your own.
Of course, yeah, well, yeah. That's a big
on the
part
double.
of it, yeah. But the Mars project used non-invasive, in other words, you're not digging.
Yes.
All sorts of fancy tomography and there was some sort of seismic measuring equipment that they were able to create sound waves through the monument and to measure them at various points around the perimeter to try and determine whether there were cavities or hard structures, rock or whatever, in the interior of the monument. Now, the project didn't reach any firm conclusions. But the very best guess that they can make based on the data is that there's definitely another mound underneath the mound that we see about halfway down or a little bit further. There's a harder mound that's got more gravel in it than soil, and that right at the center of that there's what looks like rock, and there's no cavity. So
Unless there was a cavity and it had been filled.
well, one of the possibilities that has been discussed out of this is that you might, and I have to say, we're only just trying to interpret data. What there might be is a collapsed passage tomb. There might be.
Yes.
But at the very least, it seems that the project would indicate that, yeah, the likelihood is that there's a pre-Norman mound beneath the mound that we see today, the fortified mound upon which the original castle moat of Drogheda was built in the 12th or 13th century. And the best guess would be that, yeah, that might be a Bronze Age barrow, but there's still the possibility that it might be a passage tomb.
Right. I'm trying to reconcile what you're saying with my own very limited knowledge of construction. So I know if you want to build a house in a field, the very first thing that you, as I understand it, must do is scrape back all the topsoil till you hit bedrock, and then you can put your foundations on the bedrock and build up from there. But with the mound, what you're saying, that there's quite a big castle-like structure on the very top of this mound, even to this day.
Yes.
So in order for that not to subside and fall over, which it obviously hasn't done, I would have thought it would have had to have been built on bedrock. But that's obviously not the case. So rocks were put on the bedrock, and then that was your original mound, and then there was more rocks put on top of that, and then what we see now was built on top of what's on top of that, if that makes sense.
I think the higher part of the mound is more earth.
Okay.
And I think the lower part is more gravel mixed in with the earth. There is a distinct horizon, apparently.
Okay.
There's a distinct horizon between the two. Brendan Matthews, who's the local historian there in Drogheda, has been the one who has sort of brought this information to the fore, and tried to sort of interpret for us in a way that's understandable by the ordinary sort of layperson. It opens up possibilities. What it does not do, and this is the point about remote techniques, the technology, of course, and the methods are improving and evolving all the time. And of course, DNA is part of the arsenal of the modern archaeologist, as in a lot of cases, the drones. The aerial archaeology is quite an important part. In the case of Queen Maeve's cairn, it seems to be built of, it's a cairn, so it's built of loose stones. It's more difficult to get data from that type of structure than it is from an earthen mound.
Yes.
For obvious reasons.
Yes.
It's not quite solid, but it's effectively solid. There is nothing that will substitute an archaeological dig. There's nothing will be better than that at the moment. There may come a time when we're able to send in tiny robots, like nano robots.
Oh, absolutely,
into the soil and into the stones of
especially
monuments.
into a cairn where there would be the nooks and crannies for it to move.
To image and to retrieve samples. We can, in certain cases, do what's called coring, which is, like ice coring, where you put a core right down into the ground, and you bring it out and you examine all the layers and what's in them and all the rest. But at this moment in time, there's no substitute for an archaeological dig. So one of the things that I would be proposing in relation to, not so much Maeve's cairn. Maeve's cairn's a difficult one because, the problem with excavating a cairn is if you remove stones, other stones will slip and fall.
Yes.
It's very difficult to do a part excavation, I would imagine. Maybe some archaeologists listening to me are saying that's a load of rubbish, Anthony. We can, and we would figure out how to do it. But in the case of Dronehenge, for instance, that's a field that's part of a farm. It's an active farm. It's being used for crops. So it's people have been saying, since the discovery, why hasn't it been excavated? Like, well, there's a lot of reasons why it hasn't been excavated, but principal among them is it's private farmland.
Yes.
What do you want? You just barge in onto someone's farm and say we're excavating, But I think in the future what you're going to see is targeted excavation, small trenches and small targeted pits. We just excavate a couple of very small parts of it.
Yes, key locations.
Give you enough information to get datable material or whatever. And we're seeing that, of course. We saw that at Newgrange Farm at the time of the discovery, in a separate field at Newgrange Farm. Matthew and Geraldine Stout were excavating a single trench excavation on a feature that had shown up in geophysics in 2015. That could have been anything from a Victorian landscape garden feature to a medieval barn to a Neolithic cursus. And actually the dates that came back from the dig showed that it was a late Neolithic structure. But a single trench. So not a whole-scale excavation. So you're not... See, excavation, people forget, it's a destructive process. You're digging down and you're destroying, basically, the stratigraphy. And you can never put... When you dig something out, you can't put it back the way you found it. Not really.
Yeah, you can make a best effort. But...
Exactly. So without that whole-scale excavation / destruction of the stratigraphy, what you can do is targeted excavation. And I think that's, in the future, what you're going to see is a mixture of both. You're going to see very targeted, small-scale excavations to retrieve datable material and to excavate certain features. I mean, Dronehenge, there's this box, like a rectangular feature attached to the outer perimeter of the circle.
Yes, like a porch almost.
You know, a porch is what actually is one of the terms I use for it. Steve Davis thinks it might have been a ticket office. So that
entry fee.
Yeah, that you might have been going in, like, think of Gladiator, think of the Colosseum, think of, arenas where you're watching some sort of sporting activity, some sort
drama,
of ritual sacrifice activity, some sort of giant play, some sort of horse races. I mean, these things are, pardon me, some of them are mentioned in the mythology, the Enoch sites, the assembly sites, where festivities were held to mark the beginning of the harvest, etc. Where you had maybe fighting and horse racing and, I don't know, I'm just speculating, but I loved that idea that this is the ticket office. This is the entry. This is, you come in this way. You don't just walk in and watch the action. That it's a controlled environment. It's like, this is a big deal, guys. We're putting on this big show, and you have to, I don't know how you would have paid in the Neolithic. You might, actually, I'm inclined to think that the best form of payment in the Neolithic was, if not some form of stone tool, food.
Of course, yeah.
People needed to eat, didn't they?
Yeah, without a doubt.
But I'd love to see a part excavation of Dronehenge, some small portion of the porch being investigated, and then some of the double ditch features and the posts. And then at the opposite side, there's like an additional annex on the southeastern side of it, and perhaps a little trench across that. Just get enough information about it to get an age of it, and to give us something of a picture of. At the moment, we're guessing.
Of course,
it may not even be late Neolithic.
When did these types of henges stop being used? Was it immediately when these new peoples arrived to Ireland? Did it just stop dead in the water then, or?
Yeah, you see, the Bronze Age culture, what they tended to do was, first of all, that you could find a lot of burials at the pre-existing Neolithic sites, but they tended to dig into them and bury them in urns, upturned urns sometimes. You get kist burials, you get sort of open burials, almost like a bit of a graveyard. You get an awful lot of what we call barrows, which are like low earthen mounds where they get buried in, and they get buried in maybe an enclosed stone-lined grave and then a mound built over them. The henges, they kind of, like, the Bronze Age introduces just a whole new way of being, and they don't see, the thing about the Bronze Age is it's just like they arrive and they just seem to decide, we're not building big stuff like that anymore,
Yeah.
So you don't see the monumental scale, you don't see this large scale structure. You don't see it either in terms of the tombs or in the ceremonial architecture. So the henges, yeah, pretty much die out. You later see in the Iron Age large enclosures on hilltops. We kind of call those hill forts. There's a lot of examples of them in Britain, fortified hill forts. So in terms of that scale, you don't see, in the Bronze Age, you don't see giant henges. You just...
I wonder, is that a sign of...
Excuse me.
I wonder, is that a sign of an increased individualism, nearly? That people are out for themselves a bit more, there isn't as much collectivism, because, as you alluded to earlier, the building of Newgrange and such, and even the henge, it required a mass of people to cooperate and to pull together. And I wonder, did the new peoples, were they more individualistic? Like, no, I have my field over here with my cattle and I'm doing my own thing. You guys go and do your own thing. I don't know.
Well, that's perhaps the case. And I've made the observation in my book about Newgrange, I made the observation that it's in the Bronze Age that you begin to see metal weaponry.
Okay.
Now, not to say that weaponry didn't exist in the Stone Age, and apparently there are examples in Britain of fairly gruesome deaths through violent means. But you two things that happen with the introduction of metallurgy are jewellery.
Okay.
Metal jewellery.
Yeah.
Gold, etc. And metal weaponry. And I think
would that suggest a hierarchy? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure, but what it suggests to me is that we're valuing certain things, and we're valuing them enough to kill people for them.
Yes.
Just in a very broad sense.
Of course, yeah.
That's what it would suggest to me. The problem with the Neolithic monumental architecture of the Brú na Bóinne, for instance, the problem with interpreting it is, and again, this is something I've written about in my Mythical Ireland book and in my Dronehenge book, is you always have to ask the question, yeah, clearly there are a lot of people involved in building the late Neolithic monumental landscape of Brú na Bóinne. Are they cooperating willfully, or are they being coerced?
Yes, are they
or
slaves,
forced? Yeah. And you have to ask that question. NG10 and the DNA this summer has opened up that debate even more, because now we see the possibility of a dynastic ruling family that is inbreeding, basically, to keep it in the family, as it were.
Yeah.
And the only cases apparently where you see that historically are where you have ruling dynasties.
Yes, royal families.
Where you have this very, very significantly tiered societal structure, where you have royalty at the top and slaves at the bottom. So the Denshanicus myth about Douth, which is quoted in the paper about the DNA, is interesting because it mentions, not only does it mention incest, but it also mentions that the King Bressel brought all the men of Ireland to Douth to build him a tower from which he could pass to heaven. Now it's compared to the Tower of Nimrod, which is like a biblical incursion by the monastic scribes who wrote this stuff down in the Middle Ages. But I think that's interesting because it suggests that this megalomaniac was so full of himself that he was like, yeah, I'm going to bring all the men in the country here to build me something for me that I can access heaven. Otherworld mounds, the She, perhaps were seen as access points to, the afterlife or whatever. But I just think it's interesting. It still doesn't answer the question for me as to whether he brought them against their will or whether he brought them by gently coercing them to become involved in. I mean, clearly you need large-scale cooperation for that sort of thing, don't you?
Oh, without doubt.
Regardless of whether you're cracking the whip with them or whether you're, say, trying to... It may be more egalitarian. You may find that in the Neolithic what was happening was they were saying, lads, we've got this big project on, we need bodies to help build it, and we're going to pay you with food.
Yeah, without doubt.
Maybe because the Douth legend mentions that this all happened at the time when there was a disease, a murrain, a famine among the cattle of Ireland. That perhaps something like foot and mouth disease or red water or something. And there was only one bull and 7 cows left in Ireland. So it doesn't specifically say it, of course, but my one of my theories about that legend is that it suggests that a large amount of manpower, labour was being brought to one place to build a monument. But because it was a time of food deprivation, perhaps that was the key motivator, was that the king was paying people with food. He was feeding them to become involved in these projects. We see the same thing, by the way, in the famine era and afterwards, when wealthy landlords had follies built on their lands. And follies are like, as they suggest, it's a folly. It doesn't serve any particular purpose. Towers and little castles and stuff that they built on their land as a means of just employing the local labour and giving them a little bit of money for food.
And to stop them from revolting.
Possibly that too, yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So there are all sorts of questions. And it's wonderful. I mean, it's fascinating. There are so many questions. And of course, one question leads to several more questions. But in terms of bringing it all back to your question initially about Queen Maeve's cairn, I don't think you'll ever see a large-scale excavation of that in the way we've seen at, say, Knowth, for instance, where Knowth was basically stripped all the way back to the ground and put back together.
Okay.
Right? I don't think you're going to see that again. But I think in the future what you'll see is small-scale excavation combined with a battery of other techniques.
Yes.
And as the science improves, of course, those techniques will improve. And I've said it, just off the cuff there a while back, I said it, without even thinking, about nanorobots. And maybe there is a line of inquiry that archaeologists in the future will employ very tiny robots to burrow down into an archaeological monument, to take images as they're going and to retrieve samples from the interior and bring them back again. And there you have a non-destructive process, but you're actually retrieving material that you can date or whatever.
Yeah, valuable information even. You just as you were speaking there, came to mind, you're probably familiar with a dye that can be put into a human's blood, and then you go into X-ray, and then so the same kind of principle. Let's say you pour, I don't know, 20,000 gallons of a particular of water that has something in it, maybe it's radioactive or something, let it seep down and see what image that pulls back. So there's any amount of different things that could possibly be done.
Yeah, and I mean, we've just as I said, in the past decade, actually in the past 7 years, the DNA has just completely revolutionized. It's completely overthrown some aspects of archaeology. I mean, we're now not even sure if there was what we call a Celtic invasion, the Celts and the Iron Age. There's beginning to suggest now that the language, the Irish language as we know it, evolved. We were always told it was brought by the Celts, but apparently now they're saying no, it's actually more likely, because we don't see evidence in the DNA for a big incursion in the Iron Age. It's more likely that the language began to bed down in the Bronze Age. Whatever it emerged from, we're told Proto-Indo-European was the language that would have been used, in prehistory before Irish. I'm sure none of us can know, because we only see writing with the arrival of Christianity. It was the first time you see writing, Ogham, and then the manuscripts. Before that, we've nothing apart from the symbols on the megalithic sites, which are not a language as such. They're quite an abstract form.
Have they ever been not transcribed, but have they interpreted, say, with any degree of accuracy that anyone can really stand over?
No.
The
short answer is no.
Could we someday, do you think, find the equivalent of what was it called, the Rosetta Stone? Isn't that what translated a lot of the hieroglyphics?
I don't believe we will either, because I believe the megalithic art is not a language. So the hieroglyphs, it turned out, were a language.
Okay.
They were characters in an alphabet that formed words.
Yes. The
symbols on the megalithic, it's more abstract. That's not to say it's entirely abstract and entirely non-representational. There's a whole discussion there. Martin Brennan, who's a very controversial American artist, interpreted a lot of megalithic art in his book, The Stones of Time, originally published as The Stars and the Stones. And a lot of people who follow Mythical Ireland and have read my books will be aware of Brennan. Brennan was controversial because he proposed that almost everything in megalithic art had an astronomical and a cosmological meaning and derivation, and put forward what a lot of people consider to be very convincing theories around that. And of course that marries in very nicely with the fact that Newgrange admits the sun on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, and Doubt does the same in the afternoon, and Cairntee at Loughcrew for the equinoxes. So it seems to tie up very nicely with certain aspects of the monuments. But the mainstream academic establishment are thoroughly unconvinced of his theories. The problem we have there is very straightforward. We don't have any written manual from the time that says, yeah, my name is Stoney McFlint. I'm an artist here at Newgrange, and I'm one of the lads now that's carving the stones, or maybe it's a woman. Okay, fair enough. And I'm going to tell you now that this symbol here, the spiral, I'm going to tell you the meaning of it. There's nothing that says there's any meaning. And of course, it's another thing in Jungian psychology. If you looked at the whole thing psychologically, one of the big questions that people ask at Brunabonia is what do the symbols mean? You know, it's like, why are you hung up on what they mean? Of course, I have been too in my work. It's not like I haven't tried to interpret the meaning of symbols, but perhaps the meaning is entirely subjective. Perhaps it's entirely personal to the artist at the time. Perhaps it doesn't have a universal meaning. Perhaps it doesn't actually have an empirical, describable meaning. Perhaps you're supposed to just meditate on these symbols. It has often been said by the guides at Newgrange that the art and the monument will reflect back at you what you bring to them. So your own prejudices and your own subjective approach to things will no doubt be reflected back at you. And of course, I came to the whole thing 21 years ago as an astronomer. So I see lots of astronomy on the stones at Brunabonia. Of course I do. I see suns and moons and stars, and I see spirals that represent solar movement, and I see circles that represent the movements of the stars. Of course I see all that. Does that mean I'm right?
You know, what's that saying? To a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
There you go. The only way I think we are ever going to satisfactorily answer that is if we get Doc and Marty McFly on the job and we get the DeLorean to go back in time, you know. And even if we could, sure, we'd have to overcome the language barrier because we don't know what language they might have spoken. You know, and to personally ask the artists of the time, what's the meaning of this? And maybe we might find out that, a lot of it's to do with astronomy and the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars. Or maybe we'll find that no, I just took a few mushrooms one day and I was tripping, man. And this is, this is what I saw, and I just decided to carve it into the stone. You know, who knows? It's a very, very subjective area. Doesn't make it any less interesting, of course. But what it means is that we can. I don't think we're ever going to be able to fully answer that question.
Is there reason to believe that whoever built Newgrange in the first place didn't do any of that work with the stones, and that was done 500,000 years later,
no,
at a different time? So.
No, the biggest argument in favour of the carvings being done at the time the monument was built is the fact that there is hidden art on surfaces of the stones that was carved before the stones were put into place and is now hidden from view.
Yes.
So I think that's kind of the biggest argument against the notion that the carvings were added later. That's not to say that all the carvings that you see at Newgrange and Nowth, for instance, and at Cairntee at Loughcrew, just to take examples, that's not to say that they were all done at the same time when the monument was built. Of course, stuff could have been added later. Same way as with the graffiti. You know, one of the things that Newgrange is famous for is its graffiti, and Nowth as well. By the way, there's Viking graffiti in Nowth.
Really? Wow.
There's medieval graffiti in Nowth. In Newgrange, you'll see initials and names and dates from the 1800s and mostly the 1800s. Then the monument, I think the first act pertaining to national monuments was enacted in the 1880s. Might have been 1888 actually. It was definitely in the 1880s. But before that, people are coming and going into Newgrange, and as they're coming, they're getting nails and things. They're carving their initials into stones.
Yes.
Which is obviously something we don't like people doing now. But I'm just using that as an example. It's not necessarily the case that all of the megalithic art that you see at Brunebonia was there. In fact, we know that stones were reused. Stones from earlier monuments were reused in later monuments.
How do we know that?
Well, because they got megalithic art on them. One of the ceiling stones in the chamber of Knowth, the corbelled ceiling, has carvings on it, and it's believed that the stone was brought from somewhere else. See, there's a huge amount of satellite mounds at Knowth, and when they were excavated, most of the stones were missing in a lot of cases. And it's probably a case that they were just reused when they were expanding the bigger mound.
Okay, yes,
you know?
yes.
There's a medieval house, or the foundations of, at Knowth, and one of the stones has a spiral and other megalithic art on it. So it was just robbed from probably one of the smaller tombs. It was like, oh yeah, there's a handy source of stone, you know.
Of course, yeah, no, it's fascinating. I've often thought that there might be somewhere beside Newgrange, essentially a dump, where you'd find loads of all these ornate stones that have been beautifully marked, but then, you know, the rock that they were using to make the mark cracked it or chipped it, or, you know, and I was like, this is no good. So because there was something real about what happened back then, like what you were saying about them needing a stone. There's a stone in this other one here, like real everyday today stuff happened back then like it happens now. Do you know, like, I know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the practicalities.
That's the word I was looking for. Absolutely.
Because as sacred as everything is deemed to be, we know that they reused stones from older monuments, so things weren't obviously that sacred, you know. And unfortunately, the worst or the best example, depending on your viewpoint, of reusing stuff is it occurs again in the last few centuries when, you know, starting in the 18th century, contractors start to rob stone from monuments to use it to be broken up as road material for foundations of roads.
Jesus, right.
You know, and gateposts and walls. I mean, Carrowmore is a brilliant example. Listahel, which is a very controversially restored cairn with the Gabion baskets, it looks hideous, and I don't mind saying that. It looks terrible, right? That cairn, the stones from that were taken in recent centuries and used to build field walls, dry stone walling, as field boundaries. And in 1997, the decision was made, we're going to take down all those field boundaries and we're going to put the stones back and build the cairn again.
Right.
Fascinating stuff. At least in that case, the stone is still there. In the case of Douth in particular, some of the stone was taken by a contractor to be used as foundation material for the road that runs past. So we don't know how much material was taken from Douth, probably a substantial amount. Newgrange survived thanks to the intervention of Edward Lloyd, who was a Welsh antiquarian who arrived just after Charles Campbell, the then tenant of the land, had started to order his servants to remove stone from Newgrange to build his house and his buildings and material for his roads. As it happens, they just happened by circumstance, by coincidence. They started to remove stone from where the entrance is, and shortly after they discovered the entrance curbstone with its lovely decoration and its spirals, and the roof box and the entrance to the chamber.
And that was enough to stop them from basically...
Well, that wasn't enough to stop them. I think Lloyd was one of those who had come along in 1899 and may have intervened and may have said, listen, don't take any more stone from this. This is a very important, you know, structure. But a huge amount of damage was done in the intervening centuries to a lot of monuments in Ireland. It seems that landowners and tenants, particularly those, by the way, who are non-native, seem to have had very little care for monuments.
Okay, so a wealthy English landlord or whatever that was given land in Ireland, what shit does he give about the ancient Irish?
The natives, of course, were very superstitious about the monuments. They were the Sidhe, they were the realms of the fairies, they were the abodes of the spirits. They shouldn't be touched or damaged under pain of death in some cases. And Martin Byrne was relaying to me at Carrowmore how, you know, when the grave robbing antiquarians came along in the 19th century, that the locals wouldn't dig into these mounds because they were like, no. And once they found bones, they were like, no,
I'm out
of here. Get someone else to do your dirty work for you, you know. But unfortunately, the superstition did not prevent a lot of monuments from being damaged and wholesale destroyed, you know. So it's one of those things. It's like I just wonder sometimes whether we differentiate between the archaeologist who's qualified and we see them as professional, and it's okay for you to go in there and strip the bones out of a place, but it's not okay for a Victorian grave robber to do the same thing. I just don't know. It's just a curious thing in my mind as to why we see it as okay to go in there, and take these burials out of monuments where we didn't see it okay in previous generations. We're very lucky in any case that we have as much as we have in terms of especially Neolithic monumental architecture and surviving standing monuments, because we do know that a lot was damaged and destroyed, so we're lucky that we have what we have. But I always say that I don't really want to get into the argument about medieval archaeology and how prevalent it is. What I wanted to do is to certainly focus the efforts on, preserving our 5,000-year-old monuments, because once one of those disappears, you have lost something extremely precious and thoroughly unique. Every one of them is unique in its own way because they're all different, in some aspect of its design. So they're definitely worth fighting for.
Oh, without a doubt. And it's funny, it's not until we started talking about this along the lines that it made me think of the sanctity of these places.
Yeah.
Yourself, when you've heard something 1,000 times, it loses its meaning. So I would have heard the term in relation to Newgrange say it was a passage tomb, it was a burial site, it was blah. But these things, you just rhyme them off, and you don't hear this is where they buried their dead. Do you know that kind of, there's something lost when you kind of give it a name.
Yeah, and a label.
Yeah, right. It's a euphemism.
Yeah, everything's
really.
labelled. I mean, the terrible thing about the antiquarians who mapped the sites is that they gave them letters. Cairn T, Mound A, Standing Stone C. Like, it dreadfully depersonalizes them and
massively,
strips them down to just basically a label, a functional thing, not the human story of, well, as we know now about what we call NG10. What was his name? We, of course, we can't know that, but these people had names. They lived lives. They had relations. They some of them, were possibly responsible for, inaugurating the monumental structures. They were the ones, perhaps some of those buried in Newgrange and Nowth and Douth were the ones who, as the myth suggests, were the ones who said, right, we're going to build these big monuments. And we have reduced them to just labels in appendices
yes.
at the back of a book. Appendix A will deal with the human remains, and there are descriptions of the bone fragments. And they've lost all their humanity and all their humanness. They're just things, items. They're just evidence. They're data for us now.
It's the reductionist scientific viewpoint, really, isn't it?
And at one point, these people were very precious to their immediate family. They, it's like, where did we lose that? Where did human remains suddenly become just,
fair game?
I don't know, but because I'm fascinated by it too. I'm not.
Yeah,
I'm part of the problem. I'm not looking at this from some elevated moral platform.
Yes.
I'm not pontificating. I'm just asking the question, and it applies to me just as much as it does to any of the specialists, any of the archaeologists and scientists. It definitely applies to me because I'm equally fascinated, of course. Why are we so interested in the stories of those of the past? In indigenous cultures all around the world, the reason they were important was because they were ancestors, and they were the ones whose existence led to our existence.
Yes.
And so we honoured them for that. But now we see them as, data. Yeah, great. Let's find out what people in the past were like and what they did and we just seem to have this. It's forensic on one hand, but it's also a little bit neurotic, I think, you know. It's like, why do we want to know all these things? When are we ever going to answer the questions about ourselves when we do all this?
Or even ask the questions about ourselves.
Are we avoiding?
Oh, without a doubt.
You know?
Without a doubt.
Are we avoiding putting ourselves under the microscope? And I don't mean the physical microscope, I mean the metaphorical one. Are we doing exactly as Jung said? We're doing anything to avoid that painful journey into ourselves that every one of us needs to make to grow, in order to grow, you know?
Yeah, I think that exact thing has been very much exposed with, especially our first lockdown here in Ireland, the 3 months that no one was allowed to basically go anywhere. A lot of people found themselves with a hell of a lot of time on their hands. And some people, some people thrived because of whatever reasons, and some people, wouldn't have, because just that time by yourself.
Yes.
Like people give out about the commute, and they give out about the 9 to 5 and about the rat race. But it serves a purpose.
Somehow it makes them feel normal.
Well, it distracts themselves from themselves, I think. I heard a great quote recently from, I think it was St. Francis of Assisi: "What we are looking for is what is looking." I thought that was a cool one. And there's something that rings true about that quote in relation to digging up Newgrange. You're digging up these things, and you're constantly looking for new information, new discoveries, new finds, new henges. Something, you're constantly looking, but what you should be looking for or trying to get in touch with is what's doing the looking.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting viewpoint in relation to the lockdown. I mean, I would personally say that the pandemic has had a few silver linings for me personally, definitely. And I'm definitely enjoying not commuting to Dublin to work. Definitely, that's one of them. I have more time and more energy for other things. I have more time for my family, which is important. In terms of how people have dealt with that, and it's different for everybody, of course. Unfortunately, I think you're going to see a substantial mental health issue in the wake of this. You're going to see a lot of people who had issues with their mental health beforehand, who have now substantial extra challenges as a result of it.
Without a doubt.
People who are inclined to suffer from, for instance, anxiety and depression. I'm thinking first and foremost of that type of person. People who are dealing with domestic abuse situations, who suddenly find themselves locked in the house with their abusive partner, all that sort of stuff. So I think that's going to be a significant, and we're not going to realise the extent of that for a year or two. And we may well, fingers crossed, touch wood, say your prayers and all that, we may well, hopefully, when we come out of this, and I believe we will come out of it, we may well find that we've a much bigger problem to deal with when the immediacy of COVID-19 has gone away, and when we have a vaccine, or when sometimes with these things, I know Trump said it, and it was greeted with great controversy, and it was right to be greeted with controversy, but like you do find like SARS was the first version of this, wasn't it? SARS was like COVID version 1. This is like a new version of it. SARS went away, that sometimes these things dissipate over time. Maybe herd immunity is part of it, and I'm not really wanting to get drawn into, because I'm very careful, and I'm with the scientists on this. I'm not an anti-masker, and I'm not an anti-vaxxer. If a vaccine comes along and it's proven to be safe, I will take it. Of course I will. But I believe that there'll be a problem after COVID has kind of started to subside. And that problem, actually, I believe it's manifesting itself already. A lot of people have basically gone... Sorry, I have to be very careful with my words here, because I don't want to... You have to be very careful not to stigmatize mental health, because it's a huge issue and it's widespread. And it's far more widespread than we would ever admit.
Oh, it's rampant. Absolutely rampant. Yeah.
So you I never belittle those who are suffering. But some people have literally cracked up under the strain of working from home, or being out of work, being cocooned, being trapped within 4 walls all day long. And that's manifesting itself in different ways. I believe some of the way it's manifesting itself online is in trolling and anti-government rhetoric and fascism and, racism and trolling and all that sort of stuff. That's one of the signs of it, But in a year or two's time, I think we'll probably begin to see, and we'll begin to realize. I think when the history books are written about this period of time, one of the things that will be said is a total lockdown was the bad way to go.
Yeah, no, I'd be inclined to agree with you.
Because, well, now what you're seeing is we've learned the lesson. We can't keep shutting the entire country down. It's had too much of a drastic effect. You have to have localized lockdowns and all that. Grand. So we're learning as we go along. But one of the things that will be written, I believe, in the future about this period of time is a total lockdown and restricting people's movement was the wrong thing to do. It was containing the virus, but it was doing so much other damage, economic damage, mental health damage and all that, that it ultimately will have been seen to have been the wrong approach.
Yeah, and look, as they say, hindsight is always 20/20, and I think
hindsight's a great thing.
Yeah, it sure is. It sure
we're
is.
all experts when we're looking back.
Yes. And I remember at the time when lockdown happened and the whole country came into a shutdown, my own personal thoughts on it was that it was an overreaction, but that sometimes an overreaction is the right reaction. We didn't know what was happening. We had this ghostly virus thing that seemed to be coming towards us. Let's just shut everything down, take a deep breath, and kind of see where it goes.
Yeah. Unprecedented times, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
We haven't really dealt with anything.
No, and like we've had
on a worldwide scale.
Exactly.
Even though it's been forecast for years that it would happen. Now we've seen it. At last, the predictions have come true. And now we know the potential for the future in terms of this may be the first of a series of these things to happen. And we've got to alter our behaviour in order to make sure these things don't continue to happen. And of course, well, look, it doesn't matter. On the bigger scale of things, we're just the pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan referred to the Earth.
Absolutely. Suspended in a sunbeam.
All of the people who've lived and died, all the human beings have lived and died on this small planet. We haven't had any fatalities on the moon, or we haven't gone to Mars yet. So that may happen in the future. We just convinced ourselves that it was okay, even though the alarm bells have been ringing for decades. We convinced ourselves it's perfectly okay for us to hop on a plane and go to a business meeting in Brussels or in London or whatever. We don't think twice about it. It's just as normal for us as getting in the car and driving to the office 5 minutes away. And all of a sudden, Mother Nature is saying to us, look, you knew this was wrong. And I kind of tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen. And now I'm forcing you to actually do something about it. In this, I mean, I went to the United States with my wife in November. I was given a lecture about Dronehenge at Princeton University.
Wow.
And little did I know when we came back on the plane in late November that within the space of a few months, not only would America be riddled with this virus, much more so than a lot of European countries, but that air travel to and from the States or to and from different parts of Europe would suddenly be a very difficult thing because, well, the number of flights, of course, plummeted, reduced massively. But then all of a sudden you had this, well, if I go there, do I have to quarantine? So if you want to go to a certain country, first thing you have to do is isolate for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
That suddenly makes a 1-day business trip a 15-day business
yes,
trip, you know?
Course, yeah.
And so it's all of a sudden, a very different scenario, isn't it? You know?
Completely.
Anyway, what's the point? Sorry.
No,
why did you drag me down this rabbit hole? I'm blaming you. It's your fault. I didn't know. When I sat down here, I honestly didn't know where this was going to go. I had a feeling we'd talk about Dronehenge. This is the wonderful thing about this, and this is why I was so anxious to come back, is it does not feel like an interview or anything like that. It doesn't remind me of anything I've ever encountered in terms of, people. It's just a free discussion, and it goes where it goes. And this is one of the wonderful things about your podcast. And I've listened to several of your other guests, and it's just literally you can take a turn and go down this avenue or this avenue or this avenue, and there's no agenda.
No, none.
You're not coming here and saying, no, Anthony, I disagree with you, and you're not going to labour that point. You're not talking over me. You're not berating me for, we're just having this wonderful free-flowing discussion.
Yeah, I
know?
love it. I wouldn't have it any other way. And with you in particular, I could have made a list of things that I wanted to talk to you about, because this is what, your third time on now. So we've never mentioned, you mentioned it briefly earlier, the radio thing. I want to talk to you about the Morse code thing. I want to talk to you about the brass band thing. You have all these different avenues. And if I had a list of things in front of me that I wanted to cover with you, then I don't know, it just takes the naturalness out of the conversation, you know.
Of course. No, I actually, it struck me that I should say that while we're on air, is that one of the reasons I was so delighted when you reached out and asked me to come back was because I've done a lot of radio and TV and podcast and interviews over the years. I've done hundreds of hours, and I have never encountered a scenario like this where it's just totally free flowing. And I believe it's very valuable, because because it's so free flowing, I suddenly, I mean, the thing about nanorobots going into mounds, I never thought that thought before today. And there's something now that I believe these conversations are very fruitful. I also believe that it's very important in terms of a record. Like, please don't take this the wrong way, and I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way. It seems that I'm becoming famous, right? And I don't seek fame. I'm not interested in fame. What I'm interested in is the things that I'm passionate about and sharing that passion with others. It may be that in time people will refer to this material in the future and go, you know, this was just before Anthony Murphy became a household name. And it's just nice to have that stuff there so that people, it's like a lovely sort of historical record, you know? I don't know if that makes sense. You're looking at me very strange.
Not at all. Not at all. I'm nodding in agreement in my head, whatever about my face, because I've listened back, because I had nearly a 2-year break from doing the podcast, coming back. So especially with yourself, I would have listened back to a couple of our previous conversations, and listening to me 2 years ago, it's so valuable for me, just on a real personal level. You know, having that, and especially when I was speaking to Ivan McQuillan, who introduced me to psychedelics, I'm listening to myself, quizzing him on what he knew, and looking back, I now know more than I think Ivan knew then. But he's obviously progressed, so he knows more now. But it's funny listening back to the less educated version of myself. Like, that's been immensely beneficial.
Well,
for
I
me.
think, look, the greatest thing of all, and this is something my study of Jungian psychology, something I became interested in about 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, was Jung. Everybody who studies mythology eventually encounters Jung anyway. And the wonderful thing I've discovered about Jung is that Jung believed, among many, many, many things, that the greatest journey that you make in life is your own journey, right? What Joseph Campbell refers to as beating your own path through the wilderness, not following the predefined paths that are there already.
Going off the lead in my terminology.
Yeah, you know? And that journey of self-discovery. Now, what people possibly don't know about me, but I like to think that they do, having read some of my books, is I am incredibly self-critical. I mean, Fran, to a ridiculous degree.
Yeah.
I'm the sort of person who, if I pick up my book and I read a page of it, I'm like, oh, geez, I can't believe I said that. What a dope.
Do you have the flip side of that?
Yeah. I mean, I understand, you know, yes, of course. There are moments where I'm like, do you know, Anthony, that chapter of that book is among the most beautiful things you've ever composed.
Okay, I'm glad to hear you have the flip side.
Yes,
of
course. But I'm intensely self-critical.
Yes.
Intensely. Always of the opinion that I'm not an expert, I'm learning.
Yes.
And as far as I'm concerned, I will be learning until I draw my last breath. And that I'm happy to be that way. I have been critical of others in my life. There's times when I've been less mature. There's times when I've projected, which is a big thing in psychology. So you project your deficiencies onto others. I've said and done things to people that hurt their feelings, that I regret. I'm fucking human, right?
Yes.
Excuse the language, but and that's one thing I don't like doing. Actually, I don't like using language, but sometimes it's the best way of expressing I'm human, right? So being human, you realize that you have this ego projection, you have this mask that you wear, you have this persona, and are you able to, as a person, to take that off and put it to one side? Are you able to park the ego, take off the mask, realize that the persona is something that you're performing,
Yes.
right? Persona is personal to you, but at the same time, it is your public face. It is your public, what you would say, it's your public personality or your characteristics. When you take it off and you park it, are you able to look at the delicate, fragile, fault-ridden, I would say, which is another way of saying, that you're a sinner. There are some aspects of Christianity that are valuable, right?
No doubt.
That are you able to look at that, and are you able to meet your own gaze in that mirror, the mirror that Jung refers to as the one that faithfully reflects back at you exactly who you really are, not the persona, not the mask that you put on. And that the reason that's important, and as far as I'm concerned, it is critically relative to where we are in the world right now at this moment, because there are a great number of people, mostly in the Western world, who are full of hate and full of anger and full of vitriol, who are projecting onto others, mostly minorities, their own deficiencies as human beings. So behind that confident public speaker and writer and presenter of myths and monuments and all the rest is actually a fragile human being who realizes his own restrictions, his own faults, and his own mortality. And I think that's been most important to me. I always get nervous when I'm giving talks and I'm being asked questions by an audience. I'm always conscious of my own shortcomings. I have a big library. I have 880 books. And it projects the image to the public that he's well read, he knows everything. But my attitude is, shit, I haven't read nearly enough of those, and I haven't memorized nearly enough information from them. As far as I'm concerned, I am coming from a place of deficiency, not a place of absolute knowledge and confidence.
Yes.
I am always coming from, and I'm nearly apologetic half the time when I say things like, I'm not sure that this is the case, and if I'm wrong, and I always kind of trying to always say that. It's always just realizing the limitations of your knowledge. What is it? There's a very famous quote that's, I can't remember who it was attributed to, but it's something like this. The wise are full of doubt, and the confident are the fool is full of confidence. Something like that.
Yeah, no, I get the sentiment. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That the wisest person, I believe, is the one who always realizes that there's more learning to be done and there's more growing to be done, which is, I think, a term that Jung used. If your listeners are interested at all in what I'm talking about, one of the things that I would highly recommend they read is one of the biographies of Jung. Not his own work, because it's quite wordy and it can be difficult to read. Read Maria von Franz's, she was a colleague of his, her biography of Jung. Read Lawrence van der Post's biography of Jung. And if you want to read Jung's work, a very good place to start is his book that's called Modern Man in Search of a Soul.
Modern Man in Search of a Soul.
Yeah. Because Jung Now, Jung died in the 1960s, but Jung's work is more relevant today than it was in the 20th century. Jung looked at all of the ailments of modern society. And this is pre-internet. This is pre-hopping on a plane to go on to a business meeting in London, hopping on a plane to go on holidays in Spain. This is before all that. He examined all the maladies and the ailments of modern Western culture and life and society and capitalism and all that goes with it and city life. And was able to find, I think, the root causes of a lot of the mental illnesses of the modern era. Of course, the two things go hand in hand, for God's sake. You know, one of the things that is prescribed apparently by a lot of practitioners who would be in the mental health arena is you need to get out more, you need to walk more, you need to get among nature more, take a walk along the sea, along the river, go out and see wildlife. And there, in that simple statement, you have it's a broad stroke. Okay, fair enough. It's a broad stroke on a canvas, and I'm being general. I'm not being too specific, but there, in a general form, is one of the biggest maladies, one of the biggest sicknesses of what we've just been talking about getting into a train or a bus or on into your car and getting into traffic jams for 2 hours in the day to go to a job in an office in a city where you're boxed in all day long with people that, let's be honest, if you had the choice, you wouldn't spend much time with. In some cases, I actually happen to get on very well with a lot of my colleagues, and I certainly wouldn't say that about them, but I think there's a lot of people who go to jobs that are not fulfilling. They work with people who don't bring any joy to them. They're completely deprived of nature. And then people wonder, why am I depressed? Why am I anxious? Why am I mentally ill? Why am I suffering these ailments? You know, that's a big part of the reason why. One of the things that I really love about the hobby of photography is that it puts me out into the landscape, and it gets me out of these four-wall situations, and it puts me out there. And especially at the times of day, I tend to be active with photography, especially the twilight hours.
Dawn and dusk, basically.
Yeah, it's very special. It's very special seeing the world come alive in the morning, but especially seeing the world go to sleep in the evening and watching the stars come out and listening to the last bird song and seeing the first bats come out and seeing the salmon jumping out of the water to de-lice themselves and all that stuff that you see that you would never see otherwise because you're stuck indoors doing the habitual things, you know, watching soap operas on TV, killing your time, wasting your valuable time doing stupid, repetitive things. Convincing yourself that my worth is derived from my work, or my worth is derived from, you know, these repetitive habits that I have, and not realizing that there's a much, much greater existence out there. You know, the very best thing you can do as a human being, I believe, is it's to grow, and it's to grow by interacting with your fellow human beings and the world in a meaningful way. And what we've been doing is we're interacting in what are largely meaningless ways. We're serving the bank manager.
Oh, very much so. You know, absolutely.
First and foremost, we're serving the bank manager. We're not serving our own interests. And we're not serving our own self-preservation as much as we like to think we are. We build up all this sense of permanence around us, you know, by building houses and living in them and owning all these material possessions that we give ourselves a sense of importance and permanence. But really, we're just passing through. What is it Proximo says in Gladiator? Shadows and dust, you know?
Shadows and dust.
Shadows and dust. Yeah, that's all we are. Shadows and dust. He says it just before he gets killed. The centurions come in and stab him in the back. He's the guy who trains the gladiators, you know. He's played by Oliver Reed in the film.
I remember the scene.
It was Oliver Reed's last performance. He died during the making of the film. Shadows and dust. And I think when you realise that, when you actually truly realise or come to some realisation of it, I think some people have near-death experiences. Some people have had very bad accidents or diseases. I don't want that. But I want, as a healthy person, to realise my mortality.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, and to realise that your time is short and it is important to. Now, I'm the sort of fella that I don't always practice what I preach either.
Like the rest of us.
You know? So I do invest in material goods. You know, I do have hobbies. I buy drones and cameras and ham radio equipment, and you know, so it's not like it's not like I've denounced the capitalist materialist world and gone off to live in the jungle.
But I think there's a halfway point there, because I think you can't jump out of it completely unless, you know, you want to live in a cave and, you know, eat whatever falls out of the trees. But you know, you can. There's a midway point between having seasonal clothes, so you know the t-shirts you wear in January and the t-shirts you wear in February, do you know, that kind of way, like, and really buying into the hyper commercialization and all that. There's a midway point between that and living in the cave. Do you know that kind of way? Like I've always said, like, I want to be self-sufficient and I want to be kind of off-grid and I want to do all these things, but I also want fibre optic broadband.
That's not exactly off-grid, is it?
But you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And I think too many people who, like, most people are just up to their eyeballs in this thing. They're so steeped in capitalism, basically, and advertising.
Well, serving debt, yeah.
And serving, exactly. They're so steeped in that when they think about getting away from it, they say, well, there's no point in getting away from this, and this, because that'll only put me into that, this, and that other thing. So to hell with it. Yeah. But I think if more people just did a little, you know, that kind of way, it'd go a long way. Because I keep hearing this idea that we're ruled by the corporations, and Facebook and Twitter and Google and all these massive corporations. They're the ones with the power, but it's us as individuals that feed them that power.
Yeah, that last point is very apt, and I'll tell you how it ties into my own scenario, because I was just talking to my good friend and co-author Richard Moore last night, and we talked about this, about, you know, you can empower yourself to a degree. And it's very easy to become a victim and to become a statistic of the system. Of course it is. And look, at the end of the day, we all have to pay taxes, and we all have to, you know, have a driving license, and we all have to have an identity, a social welfare number, and all that stuff. We all have to have that. You can't really not have it. The sort of people who truly live off the grid are very, very, very unique and very hard to find, you know, because most of us have to live in the system to some degree, but it's the extent to which you empower yourself. So one of the examples is, in my case, I'm a writer. One of the things I do is I write, and I was talking to Richard Moore about this last night. It's like, it's such a simple thing. What do you need to do to become a writer? You need to write. And do you know the number of people who are potential authors and who have very good books in them, who never write because they make all the excuses in the world as to why they can't write? And I've heard it and I've experienced it, and it's the one piece of advice successful authors always give to budding authors is, first and foremost, you must write. You must find the time to write. As an experiment, because I was very busy, not so busy now with the lockdown, a little bit more time to write and do other things. But when I was at my busiest in life, so commuting to Dublin, full-time working, trying to run Mythical Ireland, being involved in the brass band, being involved in other things, of course, family. My God, there's 7 of us, you know. I have 5 kids. So wow. Domestic life is busy, very busy. I was like making all the excuses in the world. Like, I can't write because I've no time to write. I forced myself to find the time to write. Actually, I wrote what I consider to be a lovely book, The Cry of the Sebok, which is my first proper novel-sized work of fiction. I had written a novella a few years previously, The Land of the Ever-Living Ones. But I wrote The Cry of the Sebok, and I forced myself to find the time, even a few minutes in the day. Do you know what I did? I found, for instance, I was carpooling with my brother to go to Dublin. So one day he'd drive, next day I'd drive, next day he'd drive. When he was driving, there was an hour I was sitting in his car doing nothing, listening to the radio. I started writing when I was sitting in his car going to work. At lunchtime, some of the days in work, I was realizing I was just killing time. You know, it's like either stay at the desk and work or go for a walk or whatever. I decided some of the days to go out to the car and grab a notebook and pen and write. And then I found there was these 10 and 15 minute windows in the evening where I could sit down and write a few words. And you know what? After 6 or 8 months, I had written a novel.
Yeah, absolutely.
I forced myself.
There's such progression in that, though, because if you hadn't done that, you would have spent the rest of your life, you know, wanting to be a writer. I could have been. You know, that would have always been there, but it would have been the same. So now you've done that, you've kind of breached that gap, and now you might view yourself as only having one book of fiction behind you, but at least it's behind you. You've moved on. You've progressed.
Yeah, and in fact, what it made me realize was that you've got more time than you think you have. Now, to a certain extent, you have to. What's the word? You have to marshal your time. You have to manage it. You know, it's some of it's to do with time management. But I'm the sort of person, by the way. You know, you get all of these executive types and all these companies who believe we're going to try and maximize the productivity of our workforce. We want to get more work out of them, or more and more and more. How do we do that? Do you know what's actually very important to productivity? Is downtime and hobbies and relaxation.
Holidays.
Not filling your bloody time with more and more and more work. Because what's going to happen? You're going to crack up, you're going to have a breakdown, you're going to get physically sick because you're just working all the time.
Yeah.
Unless you really, really, really love your work, which 90% of people don't love their work that much. 10% of people are doing something that they like.
At the upper limit, I'd say.
5% maybe.
Yeah.
Right? So, very important to me, in my ability to function and do all the things that I do, very important is variety. So people say to me, hang on a second, actually, hang on, you write, you do Mythical Ireland, you take photographs, you make videos, you're in ham radio, you play in the brass band. You know, what the hell is wrong with you? And I'm like, I actually need all that to function at the level that I function at. It's very important for me. So the past week has been very busy for me. I went to Sligo. I had to file a lot of photographs. I had to make a video, which took me 2 days to make. I had to write a script for that. I wrote 2,200 words, and I ended up realizing I only needed to have half as much, and I had to cut half of it out. And then I ended up sort of kind of quite tired, you know. And so one of the evenings I was like, what am I going to do now? I need to. There's this need to. On Saturday I sat down and I made a list of stuff that I needed to do, and I got it all done. So the time Monday came around, I was like, okay, Anthony, you're starting your working week and you're tired. What are you going to do this evening? Going to do ham radio. Going to sit and just talk to people, and I'm going to do a bit of Morse code. Just to totally get out of that work, write, structure, you know, absolutely always following an agenda and absolutely always having to organize yourself, is having the freedom just to do something different. Some days it's take the camera out and go out into the landscape. And when I do that, I disappear for several hours. And I'm walking along the lanes, and walking on the Hill of Tower or the Hill of Slane, or walking at Newgrange or whatever. And maybe I'm waiting for the stars to come out, and eventually I decide to go home. And when I get home, I feel totally refreshed, totally plugged in, you know?
There's an expression, an auntie of mine who passed away only recently had, it just encapsulates what you're getting to there. She says that it's important to leave space in your head for the butterflies.
Lovely.
And it's just that, you know, because if you're all Mythical Ireland and you're all henges and you're all T2Bs and all this crack, you know, you need to separate yourself from that and to let that kind of percolate. Do you know that kind of way?
Absolutely.
And to digest it.
I think it is. I think it's quite a neurotic thing to expect humans to function like robots.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
We are humans, so what we forget with all our science and all our technology, what we forget as humans, and this is again Jung and probably other psychiatrists as well. What we forget is we have basic needs as humans. We have emotive needs. We have spiritual needs. We maybe, some of us consider ourselves to be atheistic and don't believe in any of that superstitious nonsense. We actually still have, that doesn't mean we don't have spiritual needs. We have innate needs as human beings, requirements in order to feel that we're alive and living, you know?
No, without a doubt.
Many people are going through their lives pretty much dead,
Yeah.
robotically.
Yeah, bouncing off the walls.
Wondering, by the way, at the end of the week, when they have a few minutes to sit down and think about it all, wondering, what the hell am I doing? What am I doing? So I'll give you an example. A very good friend of mine is the filmmaker Martin O'Donoghue. And Martin and I have done a bit of work together. Martin told me, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but he told me he overheard a guy on a bus one day, an older man, you know, and he was talking to one of his friends. He saw one of his friends on the bus, said, "Oh, you Jim? Well, Mick, what's the story? Just going to Dublin. Just killing the day." And Martin was like, he was so moved by this idea that the guy was just getting on a bus to go to Dublin, to maybe go to one of the museums or whatever, to maybe go to one of the shopping centres, to literally kill the day. And I just thought, in agreement, full agreement with Martin, that what a horrendous thought that you would come to the time in your life where you're literally considering that you're killing time, that you're just killing time. It is the most desperate situation for a human to end up in. To waste this most precious of all your human resources is your time. To waste it by killing it. It's not just thinking about passing it. When you think in terms of killing it, you're thinking about being violent against it, because that's how much it's gotten you down. The drudgery of your life, that you want to kill time. I consider that I don't have nearly enough time to do what I need to do in this life.
So the idea of killing it is completely alien to you.
I said to Richard last night, I need 48-hour days and 14-day weeks. Definitely in favour of 4-day weekends, by the way. You know, and this idea that I would ever get into a moronic or a totally desperate or stale state of life, that I would need to kill time. By God, if I had more spare time, I would write more books. You know, I would do something. But the other side of it is, you know, those perhaps who've had the most fulfilled experiences or most fulfilled lifetimes, or perhaps the monks, those who just spend a lot of time in quiet meditation and who don't feel the need to fill their time.
It's funny because I was going to ask you, did you meditate, and what your thoughts were on it, because there's a lot of crossover between ourselves. A couple of things that stands out is our kind of our broad array of interests. So I run a vertical farm. I have this podcast. I have I'm a martial artist, and I have all these different things that I'm interested in. But one thing that I've noticed, and let me back up a bit, pre-COVID and pre the lockdowns and all the rest of it, I was flat out down here and I had lads working with me and there was a bit of a buzz around here and everything was flying and everything was great. But then when the lockdown came and then when we came back, I got back working, but the two lads are still to come back. So I'm down here by myself an awful lot of the time. So I'd be maybe 40 hours a week down here by myself. And, you know, it's not solitary confinement, but when there's nobody else there, is it kind of solitary confinement? And what I found is I have to be listening to a podcast. I have to be listening to music. I have to be doing something. But that becomes relentless. And I've noticed I'm trying to escape from myself. I have to be doing something. I have to be doing this, have to be doing that, I have to be doing the other. Because if I'm not, like if the radio is, not the radio, but if I'm not listening to music or a podcast, all I'm left with is my thoughts. And now I have an excessive amount of time by myself, but you can see how the thoughts turn into rumination, and you start I anyway tend to start spiraling a little if I have too much time by myself. It's just something that I've been made aware of because of COVID, I suppose. And again, it's nothing more than just a growth phase for me. Like,
well, I think it's very interesting because it's very pertinent, because I think probably the very best way that you can learn where you are at your growth stage in terms of your own personal development as a human being and as a spiritual being is to put yourself in a room on your own for a while. You know, how quickly do you reach the I can't stand being here with myself point?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, if it's taking you several days, I think that's pretty good, to be honest, because there are people who wouldn't last an hour in a room on their own with their own thoughts. People are professional and who, from the outside, have all the hallmarks of success. They got a nice house and a Mercedes and plenty of money, and they go on foreign holidays and they wear nice suits. But who, if you put them in a room on their own for an hour, might absolutely crack up.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Because that is the sum total of who and what they are. Is their professional existence, or whatever it happens to be. Maybe it's their personal life that makes them. But it's interesting that I've been called a polymath.
Okay, probably not being a Renaissance man, somebody who's into everything.
Actually,
basically.
Renaissance man is a Jungian term, believe it or not. Yeah. But a polymath being somebody who's not good at maths.
Okay.
No, I'm only joking. I am actually quite bad at maths, right? So it's got nothing to do with maths, but somebody who has a vast array of interests and is quite knowledgeable in a lot of fields. And it just so happens that the sort of person that I get on with best is a polymath.
Okay.
I just happen to find people with diverse interests fascinating. For me, they're the people who it's most interesting to have a conversation with.
For obvious reasons, I suppose.
And I regret to say this, in case I'm shattering illusions. Like, I'll share this with my Mythical Ireland followers, and I'm sure some of them probably think that I'm a thoroughly nice guy and I don't ever think anything bad. But I have to be honest, there are people who absolutely bore me to shit. I've encountered people who are just so one-tracked in their whole outlook. And I pity them. I want them. These people are stuck in this mode of thinking, and they might be conspiracy theorists, or they think, life is out to get them, and they're blaming, and they're negative, and they're angry, and they're dark, and they have this maelstrom of dark energy that tries to suck you in when you come into a room. And the first thing I want to do is run for the exit. I want to be as far away from these people as possible. At the same time, in my mind, somewhere I'm like, I really pity that man or that woman. I would really like for them to see the light. I would love for them to dissolve their anger a little bit by sort of expanding their view of the world and life, by getting out more, by having more interests. And the writing is the one that I started on a while back, and it's a good fallback for me because I've experience with it from both sides. From the point of view of not believing myself good enough to be a writer, not believing I had the time to be a writer, to encountering exactly that sort of person in life. Sort of person who says, I'd love to write a book, I'd love to, but I'm not, I can't, you know what? And when you dig in and you ask them why not, you find that they're just throwing up excuses. They're just throwing up all the reasons they think they can't. But none of those things are actually true barriers to them. And I just wonder, to them becoming successful writers, successful as in publishing a book. You might make money from it, for sure. Who cares if you're enjoying it?
Is the
writing
success.
it, And who knows how much of that can be, how much of that applies to other aspects of people's lives. That actually you're just throwing up a whole pile of excuses because you've gotten into a rut. Perhaps they've had bad experiences, etc. And I think actually, going back to the point about the mental health issues around the current pandemic, I think that, as I said, in the future, you're going to find this is a very, very prevalent issue. So why is this relevant to the discussion? I think I have suffered very badly, I now realise, when I was younger, intensely badly with anxiety. To the point...
Sorry to cut across, but that you only really appreciate now?
Yes.
Looking back, yes, yeah. No, I totally get that.
The panic that would set in when I had to stand up and perform music in front of a crowd, or stand up in front of a crowd and talk. People think I'm this confident out. I am now, of course. I'm much less anxious now, but intense anxiety. And I also suffered from depression. One or two fairly serious bouts of depression that affected my relationships with my immediate family.
And everyone else, I'd imagine.
It's a wonderful starting point to this idea. Well, first of all, recovery. We use this word recovery from that. But also in your growth as a human being and your fulsome experience of life, it's very important. It starts with recognizing the issue, recognizing that you have a problem, recognizing that there's something wrong, recognizing your drawbacks and your failures, as it were, but not allowing that to become the reason that you sit in a chair all day long. Recognizing that as a motivating factor. Okay, that's what's wrong. That's what's holding me back. Now, how do I put that right? And I realize now that I could have been doing with some serious therapeutic intervention as a teenager and a young adult. I mean, Fran, I'm pouring my heart out to you here now. And I know that from listening to your podcast, you have also had mental health issues, which is why I believe it's so bloody important to talk about these things. Because I have no doubt that there's people out there who look at Anthony Murphy as a very successful human being. They look and they go, look, he's a writer, and he's distinguished, and he's appeared on TV, and he does these musical performances, and he does Morse code, and isn't he great? No, at the end of it all, I've had serious problems, serious mental health issues that could have resulted in catastrophe for me, and could have resulted in the Anthony Murphy that you see today never evolving.
Oh, without a doubt, you could have become stuck in time. Do you know, kind of stuck in that.
Or worse again, what Jung describes as this cracking up, this, developing schizophrenia, becoming psychotic, and having to be admitted to a psychiatric institution and medicated, and perhaps never ever becoming the person that every one of us has the potential to become. Well, I think the vast majority of people have. Some people have had very, very poor luck in terms of physical illness and disease and all that, and disability. But I believe that almost everybody has the ability to become a shining human being and a shining example of humanity to the rest of us.
Without a doubt, and even it not to, because I can see how somebody could hear that and think, oh, I could never reach that height. But if you just compare yourself to an older version of yourself, that's the main thing, I think, is not to be like what you were saying there. People might look at you and go, Anthony Murphy's done this, Anthony Murphy's done that, Anthony Murphy's done the other thing, but it's wrong from the get-go there, because you're looking at you're projecting. You should be looking at yourself and saying, like, this is where I am, where could I be? Do you know, kind of where, like, because nobody, no matter how much I try, I can never be Anthony Murphy, and no matter how much anybody else tries, they can never be Anthony Murphy or Barack Obama or whoever, insert whoever you're looking up to. You can never be that person. You can aspire to be maybe like them, but the only real worthwhile goal is, in my mind at least, is self-improvement.
It's to be yourself, because you're unique. We're all entirely unique. I love that. Unique means one of a kind. Entirely unique is a meaningless phrase. You're either unique or you're not. But I love saying it anyway. What is it? Dronehenge is an entirely unique monument. It's not just unique, it's entirely unique, But I would hope that in saying that I inspire in people the self-belief, never ever to approach life as killing the day and killing the time. Always to approach life as, right, look, I'm a human. I'm inside this skeleton and this flesh and this physical body, that
your meat vehicle,
that sometimes the spirit says it wants to do one thing, but the flesh says no, can't do that. I mean, at the bottom of Knocknarea last Thursday, I was like, oh, Queen Maeve's Cairn, look, it looks so splendid. But the time I was halfway up the hill, I was like, oh, jeez. Why do I do these things?
It's not that important, is it?
I wanted to turn around and go back to the car and go and get some food. But it's to understand that even in the most successful people, and I'm not saying I'm the most successful person, I'm just saying whoever you look at in life, remember that they have all had their own personal struggles. They've all encountered difficulties along the way. They didn't just magically arrive. Well, some people are very privileged to be born into wealthy families and have privilege and have handed opportunities to them to grow and to do what they do in life. But a lot of people who end up being successful, in quotes, depends on your measure of success, of course, and it's not always materialistic. In fact, it shouldn't be materialistic. It should be a combination of things. Is that they are likely to have come through several episodes of crisis.
Without a doubt, to have grown.
And so I just want people to know that I've been that human being, and you don't just suddenly arrive at a place where you're like, oh yeah, I'd say he's fairly successful if you measure success in various forms. If you have your bar chart, like as I said, it's not all about finance, and it's not all about being having appeared on TV, and it's not all about the car that you drive. You have to consider all of the different branches of life into the tree that makes you the human being that you are, and branches grow off in all sorts of different directions.
Could you name, just to kind of concretize it in my mind, could you name some of the branches? So family might be one, would it? Or,
oh yeah,
but could you name a few just to give me to flesh out that analogy?
You mean personal to me?
Well, personal to you or in general to most people.
Family. Do you know what's an interesting one? It's influence.
Okay.
And I'm not talking about social media influencers, people who post funny stuff and nonsense and think that they're important. I'm talking about getting to the point in your life where you have invested enough of your time and your energy into your work that your work has influence.
Yes.
That you're no longer just, in my case, personal to me, writing in a vacuum. You're actually finding that people are quoting your work back at you.
I'd say that's cool.
That's lovely.
Yeah, I'd say
that's lovely. But look, that's feeding the ego. I'm talking about including all the branches, your spiritual development, and that's not necessarily going to church or believing in a particular deity. You might not have a religion, but you still can grow spiritually. Your growth as a charitable individual. How do you treat others who are perhaps in a state that you might have been in your life, or that you could be in the future? How do you treat someone who's homeless or who's poor or who's got a disease or whatever? Your treatment of them says a lot about you and your own sort of development. Family. I mean, to me, family is everything. I mean, it depends again on your perspective. I'm sure there's some people who've grown up as sort of only children who for whom, or people who've lost family when they were young, and for whom, maybe they've gone wandering out into the world. And family's not a big deal to them. But I think for most of us, family is sort of, there's a painting by one of your kids, is it?
It is indeed,
yeah.
Yes.
So look, I'm seeing your office space here has the computers and the books and the diaries and the cabinets and all the rest, but it has the pictures by the kids. So like that to me draws it all back into where, we can't expect to survive and thrive as a species unless we value family. And what we've got to do is we've got to look beyond the immediate confines of our offspring and our siblings and our parents. We've got to look to the greater human family, because at the end of the day, as I said, when you zoom back out and you go off into space, we're just a pale blue dot. And all of us inhabit this little rock in space. It's not like, we project these images of territory and possession and all the rest. At the end of the day, as John F. Kennedy said, we all share this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we're all mortal. And I believe that he summarized the very best of the very best hopes and aspirations for humans. And one of the most important ones is cherishing our children's futures, knowing that we won't be here and they will.
Absolutely.
And what are we leaving for them? So by God, that's a big tree, isn't it?
It surely is.
But it's always to broaden the focus. Always take the blinkers off. Always. I mean, in my approach to everything I've written, you'll see that there's a very, very broad approach. It's like I could have just accepted or looked at things from an archaeological viewpoint or an astronomical viewpoint or the mythology, but I broadened it out to try and take. And I believe that the wider your view is, well, I mean, I think that the people who are racist and are prejudiced against, minorities are definitely the ones who have the biggest blinkers on. I happen to think that the wider the view you have, the more humanity you have, you know. And I think that we have neglected, and this is part of the problem, and it all ties in with the whole conversation actually, really, apart from the Dronehenge bit maybe. We have neglected in our duties to each other in forming and developing this modern society that we have. We think we're advanced, but in fact we've regressed in so many ways. The reason that an entire society was unlikely to suffer a neurotic or psychotic episode in medieval Ireland was because everybody lived in the same village and everybody knew each other, and you were part of a bigger community. And this is the same with many indigenous cultures around the world. When there was a problem, it was dealt with very directly. And nowadays there are so many people who are isolated. There are so many people who are living, they're part of this system, as we were talking about, commuting and going to a job that they don't enjoy. Perhaps they're coming home in the evening and they're living alone in an apartment in a city, and they're far away from where they were raised. Maybe they were raised in a village in West Cork and they're living in Finglas or Blanchardstown or somewhere in Dublin, and they're just totally disconnected to anything that ever made them, what they remember as a child. Perhaps maybe they had a very happy childhood and they love going out into the fields after school, and they remember walking home from school, and they remember collecting leaves in the autumn, and they remember going around the doors at Halloween and all that stuff that makes them part of a community and a family. And maybe now that they're isolated in a box in Finglas or wherever it happens to be, they're sick and they're suffering in a way that we can't understand. They may, as I said, they may have the nice suits, and they may be able to afford to eat out, and they may have a nice car in the driveway and all the rest, but perhaps they're really actually sick, suffering, lonely, on the verge of perhaps having a fairly major episode in their lives, just purely to do with that absolute disconnection. But maybe also they're on the internet at night and they're being sucked into hate groups and conspiracy theories because there's no one else there to kind of guide them and say, no, come here. Like, as you did in a traditional community, you'd say, I'm a bit worried about Fran. Yeah, he's spending a lot of time on his own. Let's bring him back into the circle and, let's talk to him and let's whatever needed to be done. In a lot of African and native indigenous cultures, what happened was that the youngsters, when they reached a certain age, were initiated.
Yes.
And that was a very, very important part of growth, was that your elders initiated you. And it was sometimes a frightful experience, but it carried you over a threshold, and it was the community's way of sort of keeping you on the straight and narrow, as it were. It may sound a little bit superstitious and a little bit sort of kitsch to us now, but how are we initiating ourselves now? With the leaving certificate.
Yeah.
That's our equivalent of initiation. And what it does actually is puts an intense amount of pressure on a young adult, a young human being, to conform to a certain standard and to measure up to a certain standard. And after that, whether they do or don't will determine their quote-unquote success in life.
It's worse again. It's worse again, I think, than that, though, because I think the leaving cert is a good analogy. But with the typical rites of passage, you went through an ordeal. It had to be hard to go through it. It was not worth doing if it's not difficult to get through it. So you do it, you come out the other side of it, and you've done it. But with the leaving cert, it's, you got 65%. You got X amount of points. So you both went through it, but you didn't come out of it quite as good as John came out of it.
Yeah.
At least with the more indigenous way and the kind of more old school way, you went through it, and now you're a man. You're not an A man or a B man or a C man. You're a man. Do you know that kind of way? So we've lost an awful lot by losing that rite of passage.
Well, what it doesn't value, and again, I love, you'll always hear me quoting the likes of Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was convinced that each of us must follow our bliss.
Yes.
It's a phrase he used quite a lot in his career. Follow your bliss. And what he meant by that was find that thing that lights up your soul, that makes you feel alive, that makes you feel you have a purpose in life, that you really love doing, that if you do it and you get paid for it, you'll never feel like you're working. And every one of us has that capability. What the Leaving Cert does not do, and the education system does not do at all, and the late Ken Robinson spoke an awful lot about this, was it does not help you to find your bliss. What it helps you is to, as you say, conform to a certain standard, and to pitch people against each other, to pit people against each other in this very competitive system where we're trying to get one over each other to get to the top. What it doesn't teach you is that actually every one of us has the potential to become an extraordinary human being in some way. At something you are going to be brilliant. Every one of us, without a doubt. Now that thing might be, growing peas in a grow shed.
Yeah.
Right?
Or writing about mythical Ireland.
Do you know?
Yeah.
This is the point. To you, it happens to be something that you've invested your time and passion in and you like doing. To another person, it might be, I don't know why I would do that. But everybody's different.
It's funny you say that, though.
I don't know why you'd fly drones over fields. Now, that sounds like a total waste of time, you know?
It's funny, though, that you mentioned the what I do here with the vertical farm. I've no real interest in that. That's not me following my bliss in the least.
Yeah, it's fair enough.
But in keeping with what you're saying, it's allowed me to.
Yeah, you found your bliss in other.
Exactly, because I would never have found the different things that I'm involved with now. I wouldn't have had the time or the inclination to set up this podcast or have these conversations that I get to have with people if I hadn't taken control over my own occupation. So another thing that COVID has taught me is I started this business to get out of the rat race, but what I actually did in effect was I built my own rat race. So I was I owned the wheel I was running on. But I'm still in the rat race. Do you know that kind of way? So it wasn't until COVID came that I actually gave me the time to look back and go, I was just on a path to a bigger, fancier, smoother rat wheel.
Yeah.
Do you know that kind of way? Yeah. And that wasn't the point. That's not why I started this business. So I've had to reflect on it now, and I've had to come to terms with what does that mean? If what am I doing down here if I'm not following my bliss? But I think it's important for people to maybe realize that you're not looking for the best thing possible for yourself as the next step. If you just take one step, I'm always harping on about this idea of incremental improvements. If you could just be slightly better than you were yesterday, you don't have to be the all bells and whistles glorious you.
You're not
when
trying
you
to
decide
change
to be.
the world in one day.
Exactly.
But this is what growth is about. It's about steps, isn't it?
Yes,
it's a gradual thing. It's not, you don't just suddenly mature in one day. Life is a series of, what is it? Is this Hinduism? Is it, or where is this from? Life is a series of lessons. You can choose whether you want to learn them or not, and they'll keep happening. You know that your experiences are lessons in a way. You don't just suddenly decide one day, I think I'm gonna grow up and mature as a human being today, and tomorrow I'll be certified. Yes, yeah. This is not the human equivalent of the Leaving Cert. There is no standard, because the standard is entirely subjective. It's personal to you. Your standard as to, well, how have I achieved, how have I fulfilled myself as a human being? You may feel 100% fulfilled, and you might only have, for instance, been a shelf stacker at Lidl for your entire career, and you might feel 100% satisfied that you've done everything possible and that's fine. Of course it's fine, because as I said, each journey is your own. You've beaten your own pathway through life, and it's subjective to you. It's entirely personal to you. It's interesting though that you say about that's not your bliss. I just threw it out there as an example because people might think it's a little bit odd. People sometimes find, how could you ever, like some people have found their bliss by being undertakers.
Oh, without
or
doubt,
macadam road repairers, or beekeepers, or whatever. You know?
Absolutely.
And that is why that's what is so wonderful about the human experience is that everyone is entirely unique. Everyone is unique. We're all different, and we all have different needs, and we all have different aims, and we all have different capabilities, and that's perfectly okay. But what I wouldn't want to happen to any individual is for them to end up in a situation where they're like, oh, I need to kill the day. Don't kill the day. Your every moment that you have is precious, so it's important as far as I'd be concerned anyway, it's important that if you're not seen to be active, at least convince yourself that you're taking some step towards growth.
Yeah, and even you can
You know?
you can nearly take a step back from that and just appreciate that you're not doing well.
Oh yeah, by the way, sometimes that requires that requires you just actually to stand still.
Yes.
As much as I've been talking about growth and progress, sometimes growth and progress actually requires you just to stand still. Sometimes it's a stock taking exercise. It's where you stop in your life and pause for a few days and you just go, okay, what have I been doing lately? Has it been serving me? Am I tired? If I'm tired, why am I tired? If I'm a little bit tetchy and not sleeping properly, is there a reason for that? How are my relationships with those close to me? Could I do more about that? And sometimes it's literally about stepping back and breathing and stopping. You wanted to ask me about meditation ages ago, and we got sidetracked. I don't meditate, and I don't do yoga. But my meditation comes in different forms. I thoroughly believe that my meditation are those times that I have spent many, 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 many hours, hundreds of hours, under the stars, doing my astronomy as a kid, out in the landscape at Newgrange or Tara or Slane, wherever it happens to be, taking pictures, and just being there. It, for me, has been blissful many, many times.
Just being present.
Yeah. Where you almost stop thinking.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's what the definition of being present.
Yeah. So that is my meditation. I know that what's his name? Bill Moyers asked Joseph Campbell in The Power of Myth. He asked him, what is your, do you do yoga? He said, my yoga is underlining passages in books. And I actually completely identify with that because I do quite a lot of that. I find very inspirational material in books and I underline it and I make margin notes and I take notes and that helps me form plans for my next book or something I want to write about in a blog post or discuss in a live stream or whatever. But sometimes the greatest progression or development, I don't even like those words, fulfillment, growth, comes at times of standstill.
Yeah, when you give yourself the 2 seconds to actually reflect and catch up with yourself.
And as I say, I am a habitual person to an extent, but I am very spontaneous. Spontaneity is a huge part of who I am and why I believe I'm able to do what I do. So there's an episode of Live Irish Myths. We discussed this off air, so just for your listeners, during the lockdown I started doing a daily live stream called Live Irish Myths. I started on the 12th of March and I did 102 episodes daily, every day.
That's
for
incredible.
about an hour and a half every day. Now I'm doing them weekly now, so I did episode 117 the other day. So I'll keep doing them weekly, but I was doing them daily. And there's an episode called Synchronicity, Serendipity and Spontaneity. And those are 3 things that have been very important to my story. Huge synchronicities, huge, totally unlikely coincidences happening to me. Serendipity, which is a form of sort of luck or, just being in the right place at the right time sort of thing. And spontaneity. It's being spontaneous. Suddenly deciding, I'm getting up from the desk. No, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to go out and fly the drone. I'm going to do a bit of ham radio. I'm going to sit and chat with the wife. I'm going to not to feel that your life has to be structured all the time. Actually, I think that's one of the maladies that I was speaking about earlier, is that we have become so structured now that we're robotic. And when we become robotic, I think we cease to be humans.
Very much so, yeah, 100%.
We become
dehumanizing.
We become like the machine, and we do it. What we don't realize is that we introduce the whole idea of schedule and structure into our personal lives as well as our professional lives, so that yes, I can devote 10 minutes of my time to little Johnny before he goes to school at 8:30 in the morning, and yes, I can read Johnny a bedtime story at 9:05 tonight. But that's all I can fit in for Johnny today.
Yeah.
Whereas the spontaneity is. Like one of the things I loved about the lockdown was every day, pretty much except for rare occasions, myself and my youngest son Finn, we just went out walking. We went out with the dog and we just spent. And I told him one day, we were walking in Drogheda, because we could only go 2 kilometres. It wasn't too far away from the house. We were walking along with the dog, and he took my hand. He's 11, like, he took my hand, and we were walking along, and I said, you better say it to him, Anthony, because if you don't say it, it's important. All the things, this is another thing that we regret as humans, the things we should have did or said and we didn't. Don't end up at the end of your life, because you don't know how close or how far away that is. Don't end up on your deathbed going, oh shit, I wished I'd said that day. I said to him, these have been the most precious moments of my life.
Yeah, that's lovely. How did he react?
He loved it. Threw his arms around me. He just loved it, the fact that I said it. And you know, as a man, men are under such pressure to show machismo and, you know, not to show emotion. That's bullshit. It's total bullshit. It's perfectly acceptable for a man to be emotional. I just loved that I said it, because, you know, with some of my older kids, I'd love to have had that, and I'd love to have, you know, but with him, I was like, Anthony, these moments aren't going to last. You better say it, because if you don't say it, he might never know it. And I said it, and I just felt so good about saying it. He felt so good about saying it. And it was so true. And of course, after a while, you know, the lockdown relaxes a bit, and, you know, between one thing and another, we've less time to walk, and then all of a sudden they're back at school.
Yes.
So now I don't have that time. So I'm glad I said it. By God, I'm glad I said it. And it's just another, I think, of those things that you must do. It's so important for you to do, is to say. It's not always about saying the nicest things. Sometimes you have to say what's on your mind, and that mightn't be positive. But it's to say something rather than to hold it back. You know?
Oh, absolutely.
To say that, so that you don't hold that in your head and just assume everybody knows it.
Yeah, no, without a doubt.
You know?
I've spoken about this a certain amount of length with past guest and friend of the show, Des Seepersod. And Des pulled into my house sometime after the lockdown. He builds these calisthenic rigs. That's his business. It's actually spun out of my business here. So the same materials that I built, the bays that all the stuff was growing on, he was working with me with this material. And I remember him kind of lifting them up and goes, Jesus, these are substantial. How much are these, and how do you get them delivered? And skip forward 2 years, and he's self-employed now. He has his own business building these rigs, and he goes all around the country building them and setting them up. It's a fantastic story. Febi Ireland, Freestanding Exercise Bars Ireland, FEBI. Yeah, for anyone who's interested, just look him up online or on Dundee on adverts, he sells them. But anyway, Des pulled into my house after the lockdown, and I do give him a lend in my van when he's doing his bigger installments, because he can't deliver them in his own vehicle. And he pulled into my house. Now, he hadn't been anywhere near my house in 3 months because of the lockdown, and I'd spent the 3 months basically doing up the gardens and whatever else. So I'd put major work into the house. And he pulled in, got the van and left, and he sent me a voice message, and it was basically saying, Frano, I pulled into your house and I didn't know if you got a new driveway or if you'd painted the house or if you'd knocked it and built another one. The place looks amazing. It looks absolutely fantastic. I must have played the voice message back to myself about 20 times just to hear it. But the thing myself and Des often talk about is we're so poor at doing that. Like, what we'll do is let's say myself and yourself are at a function or whatever. I'll say to somebody else, Jeez, Anthony's looking sharp, isn't he? I don't know, there's something about him. But I wouldn't say it to you. We have this thing whereby we don't say it directly. Like, you might go home to your wife and say, do you know what? I was just thinking that when I was out walking with Finn there the other day. He's my world. I love him to bits.
Yeah.
You'll say that, no problem. But the saying it directly, I don't know. You're crossing something or you're doing something that just weirds us out. I don't know why. I can't put my finger on it. I don't think it's not begrudgery, but it's like a cousin of begrudgery or something. I don't know what it is. Where I don't know.
I think a lot of people are kind of reticent about, you know, praising and saying positive things, because essentially they, believe it or not, they find it difficult to do that about themselves.
Yes.
Sometimes you kind of need to praise yourself too. say, stand back and say, well done, Anthony, you survived today, you did well today. You might have been in a challenging situation, or you might have handled somebody or a row, or you might have apologized to someone, and stand back and say, yeah, well done. I think we find it difficult to do it with ourselves, so then we find it difficult to actually, but as you say, it's much easier to say it to Joe Soap than it is to the person themselves.
Oh, I've no problem.
Because you're avoiding the potential for the person to react weirdly or negatively. Because sometimes when you say something nice to people, I think I'm a bit like that too. People have said very nice things to me at times, and they may have got an underwhelming reaction, and that's because there's partly sort of a little bit of a bashfulness, or you're just you want to say, oh, thanks, yeah, great, brilliant, yeah,
I'm amazing,
aren't I? Brilliant, but you realise then in your modesty that, well, you just have to be careful how you react, and you're maybe a little bit weirded out by it, but it's just. Oh, I think you read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was one of those people who wrote a lot about the process of dying, and that people need to realize that it comes sooner than you want it to, and a lot of people who die with regrets, and so that's one less. That's one that I've notched off. Saying what I wanted to say, and saying it so clearly. Not holding back with it. I actually told him, and pretty much those were the exact words. These have been some of the most brilliant and wonderful and precious moments of my life. And yeah, I said it, and I feel really good that I said it.
And not to ask you too personal a question, but do you have any memories of anything being said to you when you were that young? Because I would imagine your son now stands a better chance at kind of doing right by his own kids because you've done that to him. Do you know that kind of way?
Oh yeah, I mean, no, that's too personal a question, Fran. Sorry, move on.
No problem.
Yeah, what are you doing? Yeah, I mean, I certainly remember when I wrote certain things. I know my father would have sort of said very encouraging words. I used to draw, but I reckon I have dyspraxia. Would have been undiagnosed when I was a kid, but I have an issue with fine motor control and frustration with writing and drawing and stuff. But I used to draw things, and my mother used to say, and my granny, her mother, used to say, just you're very good at the drawing, just little things like that kind of. And when I was playing music, oh, you were very good today playing the music. Tiny little moments of encouragement are very important. Now, of course, the opposite can be the case where Mary and Frank think little Johnny is the best thing since sliced bread, and they only ever praise him.
Yes.
And Johnny thinks he's brilliant, and he goes out into the world, and he suddenly realizes that he's meeting all this criticism, and he's meeting these barriers because he thought life was going to be plain sailing. So I think actually a healthy situation is to have a mixture. You would need to be critical at times, and sometimes you need to. I would have a little bit of a sort of a sarcastic edge sometimes with my kids, And
no.
Yeah, you know what I mean. I would say I would criticize. I would hope in a way that doesn't come across just as blatant criticism, but in a way that sort of is said in enough to make them realize that yes, you didn't perhaps live up to your full your full potential, but here's encouragement. There's some aspect of it that. I can't think of specific examples offhand right now.
No, but
I know there's been times when I've been quite sarcastic and even cutting and impatient. But sure, look, as I said earlier on in the conversation, I'm human.
Yes.
And I think you need to be able to you need to be able to stand in front of that mirror and see that person and see the person who does and says those things. And I think once you do that, you'll always improve. Because if you see something in that you don't like, you can improve it in yourself. If you're in denial about it, you'll just project it onto everyone else.
Yes. No,
which is, by the way, one of the reasons that I do not now distinctly I distinctly dislike being in the company of somebody who gossips a lot about other people. I find that kind of person very tiresome.
Yes.
It's like just as if they're pardon the Irish. This is an Irish phrase. They think their shite doesn't smell.
Yes.
And they seem to be engaging in a hell of a lot of projection. that they just spend their whole time talking about others, and usually negatively. I find that sort of person very, very draining, because in the worst of times, and when people are in the middle of a crisis of whatever kind it might be in their life, they are actually, and they don't realize it, they're going through an episode that can result in several different outcomes. But one of those outcomes is that they can improve massively as a person from this negative experience that they're going through. And so your hope would be that in encountering this massively negative experience, maybe they're undergoing a divorce, maybe they've been in an accident, and maybe the accident is a way of life saying, slow down and think for a second. Maybe the accident is a way of saying, look, no, you're going in the wrong direction in life. And in the middle of that crisis, they're maybe down and they're feeling, despondent or whatever. That may lead to them becoming a better person in the future. So it's very, very easy to sit on the sidelines and to give. I would say never, try not to anyway. Try not to engage in too much criticism of a person where you can't envisage a scenario where you are that person dealing with their circumstances. And how would you deal with it rather than just sit there and throw stones, So how would you deal with that situation if you were in it? How would you deal with the challenges? How do you think you would overcome it? Because you know what? You never know when it might be happening to you.
It's funny because I think most people would say, I'd never get myself into that position. But the people who find themselves in that position, they never said that either.
Well,
do you know,
let me
they
tell
never
you
thought that
something.
either,
Let me tell you something. I have witnessed it firsthand. I have seen people who I know have breakdowns, have been alcoholics, go through very, very difficult domestic situations. I have seen people who have suddenly found themselves homeless. It's very easy to judge from the outside and say, oh, well, sure, look, you didn't look after things, so that's why you ended up. Very easy to say that. Very easy to judge. But you never know the full circumstances of a person's life and what they've been going through. It's very, very important too. I've encountered this too. Very, very important too, that if you hear things about somebody, very important to make sure that you get the other side of the story. And that might seem like such an almost puerile or, simplistic thing to say. But in fact, it's very relevant because sometimes people, when you get well known, right, sometimes people say stuff about you behind your back. And other people go, didn't know that about him. You've marked my cards. Will they then come to that person that they've heard this about and say, listen, I heard this about you. What do you have to say about that? Or I wanted to get the other side of the story. And that's the wonderful thing about journalism, despite the bad name that it has with a lot of people. In journalism, especially in local journalism, because you live in the same town as you write people, you're writing about people that you walk among. So you can't afford to slag them off too much. You have to be careful. It's very important in journalism that you try to get a balance to your stories. So if you hear something controversial about a group or a person, you make an effort to contact that person or that group, say, listen, this is what we've heard and we're putting it to you now. And you'll often find actually that they'll cancel out your information. You actually don't have a story to write because what you've been hearing is BS, it's nonsense. Sometimes it will have, of course, a factual basis, but you'll still get a mitigating other side of the story that makes, that makes the overall just a little bit less sensational. The easiest thing in the world, I don't even know why I went down that rabbit hole, but it's just something that I have encountered, and it's very important when somebody is motivated by anger or their own prejudice. Is sometimes very easy for them to point a finger at someone else and say, yeah, and for people to get taken in by that. So easy today in the world of the internet. You know how many people share these pictures of, share this scumbag robbed my house today, or this scumbag. How do you know that isn't a woman or a man who's sharing a picture of somebody who's jilted them? They've been in a relationship and they've gone off and done the dirty, and that this is just a revenge act on the internet. How do you know that this person actually robbed that house? You don't. People share stuff. They don't ever think about whether it might be true or not. They just share it because they think, oh, well, they're hardly saying it if it isn't true.
Yeah, it's funny. There's it's out there in the zeitgeist, this idea that it's almost as if people are under the impression that there's an internet police. Do you know that kind of way? They're under the impression that if you did write something that wasn't true, that, you'd be fined, you go to jail, your page would be taken down. Like I did it, I created a clickbaity title for one of my episodes. It was when I was starting, it was a bit of an experiment in clickbait, and it was a genuine effort to nefariously up my views when I started. And I put up a clickbaity title, and it was a genuine episode, but it was all a clickbaity title. And people were saying, you can't do that. And I was like, well, I've done it. Like, so what do you mean I can't do it? And like, you just can't. And people couldn't get their head around it. I could put something up that wasn't true and that nothing bad would come from it. And nothing could be further from the truth. You can put up whatever you want.
I actually see it every day of the week. I see stuff that the provenance of is dubious at best, if not completely fabricated, and people are sharing it. People who you know, friends or relatives, and you're like, you seriously sharing that? You think that's true?
You know better.
Come on, Once I think I was caught when I say caught, once I shared something that was a bit dubious. It was about a phantom apparition that had apparently appeared in some clouds, and there was a video showing a distant city was a view. You could see it in the clouds. It's an optical illusion called, or it's actually an atmospheric illusion called, I think is it Fata Morgana or something like that. And it's referred to in Irish folklore about how distant lands and cities can be sometimes seen as an apparition along the coasts. But I shared it, and then afterwards I realised I'd been duped, that it was a fake video. It was one of those.
Right.
So it does happen even to the best of us. But I don't share any of that stuff that has angry words on it. Share. This scumbag did this, that, and the other. And months and years after that person's picture has been taken, you still see it being shared.
Oh, I believe
and that
it,
person could be a person of good reputation whose reputation has been destroyed on the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's things have been sent to me, and I see them, I look at them, and my first knee jerk is, oh my God, that's shocking. And the second knee jerk is, hang on a second, I remember this from 3 years ago. This breaking news story from 4 years ago. Like, it's just doing the rounds again, basically.
Yeah. People are such, I just think that, we've become such, so involved in these fleeting moments, and we need these cheap thrills on social media to keep us going, that sometimes we just deprive ourselves utterly, not just of our humanity, but also of our bloody intellect and our faculties for thinking things through. It's almost like we share before we actually think.
Without a doubt.
Shoot before you draw, sort of thing,
Yes, and literally shooting yourself in the foot, say.
And and as I say, I've very highly respected friends and people who I consider to be very intelligent, who've shared stuff, and I just go, oh no, you didn't, no, please. And then you contact them by private message and say, look, that's not true, and you send them the Snopes link that proves it's not true and that it's total BS and it's totally made up. And they're like, oh, I didn't realize. Oh, I feel a little bit silly. I better delete it. Yeah. But sometimes too, it's sometimes I have an issue, which is that Mythical Ireland, whether I like it or not, is a brand name.
Yes.
It's a company now. I mean, it's not a limited company. I'm a sole trader. I actually file a tax return every year for the past 3 years because I have tax exemption on a couple of my books, artist exemption.
That's my understanding. I was just going to say, if you hadn't brought it up, my understanding of that is an artist in Ireland can earn up to, is it 50 grand a year tax free?
Yeah.
And that includes, so writers are.
You have to send samples of the work, and they have to deem them to be eligible.
Because I've often
wondered, you can't just assume that you're eligible.
Of course, but I've often
you
wondered,
have to get that status.
I've often wondered, would Off the Lead qualify? basically just the podcast, whatever about anything else that I do under that umbrella.
Yeah, well, if you Google it and you go if you Google artist exemption and you go in, it'll tell you what qualifies and what doesn't qualify. I'm not sure that podcasts qualify or whether they're in there. But of course, we consider, creative output to be paintings and books and poems and songs and things that you can look at or listen to or whatever. Podcasts, I'm just not entirely sure about at all. But Mythical Ireland is essentially a brand name in a way. It's like a business in a way. I never looked at it that way until about 3 years ago when I realized, that there's absolutely no shame or nothing absolutely wrong at all in trying to make some money out of your passion. It's like this. I think Irish people in particular, some of us have guilt around money and the possession of money. It's almost like we believe the biblical idea that a rich man can't enter heaven, that a rich person there's a better chance of a camel passing through the eye of a needle than a rich person getting into heaven. And I think we kind of took that on too robustly and too literally, But what was the point? What was the point initially? I totally lost my train of thought there.
You're grand. I'm struggling to even get us back on track myself.
Yeah, it was connected anyway. I've lost it. I'm sure if I listen back, I'll be able to
it'll be
join
fine.
them up. And sometimes I actually find that, believe it or not, that's a thing with me. I find that I lose my train of thought.
Oh God, you and me both.
And it's not just with age. This is something that has always happened to me. But I get to the top of the stairs and go, what did I come up the stairs for? And that happens. And it sometimes happens that, especially in fluent conversation like this, that I just lose the connection of where I was going with that particular point. It'll come back to me anyway.
But again, just to talk back around the beauty of these types of conversations, I think it's great for people to hear, Anthony Murphy, he's written so many books, he's published this, he's discovered that, and he forgot what he was talking about. Like, yeah, because he's only human. Like the rest of us.
Well, part of the problem is the head is so full of stuff, Like, that is an issue for me, and that is one of the reasons that it becomes very important for me to do my little meditation, which is to bring the camera out and just to spend some time at peace in the landscape, listening to the birds and that, because your head is so full. And there's an exercise that some practitioners refer to as grounding. Like it's a concept that comes from electronics and that it's very important to have a path to ground for the electricity to flow through when a crisis happens, and it's like we need to ground. Sometimes we're full of energy, and it can be all sorts of energy. It can be negative and creative, positive, constructive energy, but sometimes you just need to stand still for a little moment and with your feet on the earth and breathing in that sort of country air and just for a little bit, just allow your brain and all those things that are happening in there just to settle a little bit and just to breathe and calm down. And I actually find too that comes across if you watch, for instance, watch my YouTube videos, right? You'll see some videos where I'm extremely calm and it's paced and it's like I come to Newgrange in the evening, and then there's somewhere and I look at the contrast in that person and I see exactly what's going on. It's that the excitable, energetic person is just operating at a sort of a higher gear, more revolutions per minute. The problem with that is that has a toll on the physical body.
Absolutely. And on the psyche, I'm sure.
And how that manifests with me, which is another indication of my utter humanity and my utter sort of fallibility as a physical human being, is I get burnt out. There are people say to me, I don't know how you do all you do. It's like, well, neither do I sometimes, but I do actually physically sometimes just collapse into a heap. There's times when I just literally just cannot read another word, can't look at a screen for another minute, can't have another moment of conversation. I must just relax. In some cases, I just hit the bed. I've been known at times. It doesn't happen too often, thankfully now. It used to happen more often. But I just need to kind of collapse into a heap on a bed and just sleep for a couple of hours, sometimes in the middle of the afternoon. It's like, I just need it. Because if I don't, I'm just going to be walking around like a zombie. And it's the funny thing about, you shouldn't try to dress yourself up. I think it's very important if people are listening, and there's probably about 2 people left listening. They're all falling asleep at this stage. But it's very important for people listening to understand that being a successful person doesn't mean that you dress up every day and that you pretend. You also have to realize your limitations. And it's very, very important that you get rest. It's very important that it's like, apparently Margaret Thatcher used to be able to survive on 3 or 4 hours sleep a night. Now, after 2 nights of having 3 hours sleep, I can tell you, I would be a narky old fecker, and I would be impossible to talk to. So it's also important, even publicly, to acknowledge that, just to put that out there, just to say, look, I'm not. Nobody is superhuman. Nobody, even the fittest people, aren't superhuman.
No, without a doubt. And I think too often we put people up on pedestals as being, whether it's Margaret Thatcher or Barack Obama or anyone else, we put them up on a pedestal and see them as it's almost, there's a similarity to what we do with people we hold in high esteem. There's a similarity between that and, minorities or blacks or gays or the other. We other them. With the minorities in that, it's an othering. You're othering them and you're looking down on them. And then with people like, whoever it is, the president or a great warrior or a leader, we put them up there, but we other them. We don't see the humanity in them. We don't see their folly. We don't see their decency. Do you know where I'm coming from?
Yeah.
But again, that distance, that othering, you're separating people from you because you've separated you from you.
Well, the greatest problem of the age, and it's been a sort of a problem that's been around for a long, long time, is the dehumanization of minorities. Like, the way we should be thinking and the way that's supported by the evidence is that we're all part of the one human family. As I said, like, even regardless of race and DNA and skin color and religious belief, like, we are all on this planet together. We can separate ourselves with walls and borders, and we can make cultural and religious differences a thing, and skin colour a thing. At the end of the day, we're all breathing the same bloody oxygen, mate. And if we don't start to get on and realise that, well, I happen to believe that we have arrived at, unfortunately, a moment of extremely threatening gravity and seriousness for the future of ourselves. Not so much the planet. I think the planet will look after itself.
Planet be grand.
Well, it mightn't necessarily be grand. Remember, we're in the nuclear age. I just happen to think we've arrived at a moment of very, very great, very, very great possibility. And I don't mean that necessarily positively,
Yes, of course, yeah. It's an opportunity.
We have, of course, the wherewithal. We definitely have the resources and the wherewithal to confront and deal with all of our problems. But whether we're willing to do that is another thing, I fear that we have entered the era that I've always dreaded all my whole life. From the first moment I read the book of Revelation, and then later I got into Nostradamus, believe it or not, although I don't believe any of that stuff now. Certainly, in terms of Revelation, Jung felt that John, the divine who wrote Revelation, was not having a psychotic episode. Jung actually believes he did have a vision of the future, and it's frightening, to be quite honest. And that's the kind.
Sorry, Jung thought he himself had one.
No,
or?
Jung thought that the author of Revelation, John the Divine, was not psychotic when he wrote it. He wasn't having he was actually having a genuine psychic vision.
A moment of clarity, almost the opposite of what was said.
Yeah. So we have arrived at, I believe, or we're shortly arriving at, a fairly major event in the history of the world. I'm hoping, in saying that, that leads to some constructive action, but I'm not sure that it will, because when we've reached times like this in the past, we have hit the panic button. We've gone nuclear, as it were, and I don't mean that literally. I mean, we've gone for the Holocaust option instead of trying to negotiate around our differences and appreciate our differences and try to get on with each other. We've gone for the let's put them in the gas chambers, or let's lock them up, or let's kill them, or let's shoot them, or whatever. And I think we happen to be arriving at another of those great moments. And this one has the potential to be the greatest because of the fact that we have nuclear weapons in the control of people who are, let's face it, less than capable of maintaining a rational status throughout a crisis, you know?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, the human condition is full of inadequacies and pitfalls. And that's just in your average, everyday, decent person. But when you have somebody like Trump, for example, or even Boris, the other side of us, like they're not exactly exemplary humans. Do you know, like in a way, like I would consider both of them to be
far from it.
Below par.
Exemplary humans, far from it. In fact, we're going 3.5 hours. Okay, so I probably should stop boring your listeners sometime soon. The problem, look, the situation in the States is complex, but at the same time, it's more simple than people believe. Trump is not actually the problem. Trump is a symptom of the disease.
I couldn't agree more.
And the disease is mainly around racism and
division,
and mainly about projection. And this idea of the building of the wall, I always thought that was symbolic of building a wall in our own brains between, our rational and intuitive natures. It's like we want to cut off one from the other, which only results in a mental breakdown, a sort of a psychotic episode. We can't avoid, I think, looking at the situation, we can't avoid reaching some sort of a conclusion that America is having a very, very major breakdown and is on the verge of a catastrophe. The problem with that is America basically being in control of the entire sort of Western civilization, Western hemisphere, Western society, is that I believe if it goes, everything goes. I think we will see a very, very major catastrophe unfolding unless events change. Imagine, for instance, I'm just putting this out there, and
by all means,
I'm not trying to portray. By the way, I'm not trying to portray Trump supporters as necessarily mentally deranged. Some of them definitely are, but a lot of them, I think, are just people who are angry and who are at the bottom of the pile and who feel that they've been left behind by society, and they don't actually realize what it is that has left them behind, or who are the forces that have been involved in that. And they're angry, and angry only just leads to catastrophe eventually, unless it's channeled into positive action. And I don't see it being channeled into positive action. You know, we're at a moment when, the whole of civilization could topple over a cliff. And the question I wanted to ask was, can people imagine another 9/11 happening in America today? What do you think the reaction to that would be?
Oh, Jesus. There'd be more cities on fire than there currently is. Because
the reaction to 9/11, now 9/11 was a horrific event, and I'm not for a second going to get involved in apologising for terrorists or anything. The reaction to 9/11 was George W. Bush saying, you're either with us or you're against us.
Yes.
And we're going to war, right? And there are a lot of dead Iraqis and Afghani people who are dead now, who were alive before 9/11, who, if they were alive right now, might say, what the hell did I have to do with 9/11? It's a little bit unfair that I got killed. Because they basically had nothing to do with it. All I'm saying is you can pit George W. Bush and Donald Trump against each other in terms of, you can weigh them up against each other in terms of their abilities and their intelligence and
or lack thereof,
their leadership qualities and all the rest. But you're basically getting two versions of the same thing, and that is ultimately that America represents a lot of things. The mixture of cultures that has been, I believe, quite wonderful in one sense, but quite a catastrophe in another, because white people basically fail to get on with people who aren't white. Let's call the situation as it is, that white people are unable to get on with minorities. It's not the opposite way around. The minorities are the ones who have been oppressed and who have been deprived. But a 9/11 today, what's the reaction? Well, I can only speculate, but it's an angry reaction. It's a very angry reaction. And it probably involves starting a fairly major war. And that would drag a whole load of countries into it. And I think you'd just see the house of cards coming down. I would hate to see it happening. And that's not necessarily how it will go. I mean, people forget, crikey, people forget history so easily. You only have to look at the 20th century. The 20th century was horrific in so many respects. And as bad and all as World War II was, and Young actually personally had dreams before the Great War in which he saw Europe awash with blood. But before he died, and it's something he refused to talk about, he had visions about what we would call the end of the world. And he saw a devastated planet, large parts of it devastated. Von Franz talks about it in an interview that's on YouTube. But she doesn't want to talk about it. So Young was urging us to deal with the issues of our own darkness and shadows and our own projections, and to make that very urgent journey. And it just seems that, well, a lot of people dismiss Young anyway, unfortunately, in the favour of Freud, who believed everything came down to sex. But we ignore it at our peril. And I believe, unfortunately, I hate to strike a pessimistic note, but unless things, as far as I'm concerned, unless there's a miracle.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of people who have sort of nice fluffy beliefs about how we're all just going to embrace each other. But like, history has shown us how we deal with these situations. And actually the greatest of all the inspirational quotes for me comes from Star Wars, comes from Yoda.
Go for it.
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hatred. Hate leads to suffering. Yeah. All of these things are negative.
Succinctly put, yeah.
Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. So this hate that we see bubbling up in America is either going to be miraculously channeled into positive action, or it's going to lead to disaster. And that disaster will be greater than any of us can anticipate. It's
just the micro version of the macro version of the micro, though, isn't it? I mean, we in our own individual lives, we'll come across hurdles that, the death of a father or a child or a loved one or whatever it is, you lose your job or you become depressed or suicidal or whatever it is, you encounter a hurdle, and the hurdle you can get trapped underneath the hurdle trying to get over it. You might go around it, you might blast your way through it. But the whole growth phase that we mentioned kind of earlier, circling right back to the start, I think, what's that saying? Never let a good tragedy go. Is it never let a good tragedy go to waste? There's opportunity in it. Do you know, the kind of way, like, we're being met with this. We seem to have worked our way into this frenzy, and we'll either go through it, as you say, it'll go one of two ways. It'll either end in catastrophe, or it'll be the start of a new, more enlightened path, maybe, for want of better terminology.
Might end up being both.
More than likely, more than likely.
Yeah.
And it's funny because more and more often when I'm met with, is it either or, I'm coming around to it. It's always a bit of both. So it'll be a catastrophe if you want it to be a catastrophe. And again, it boils back down to your perception. It is what you make of it.
Yeah, and I'm aware of that too. And it's one thing that it's kind of quite prevalent in modern thinking, is that if you say something negative, then you're almost willing it to happen. I don't believe that's the case. But we've almost sort of tried to insulate ourselves from saying that things can be bad.
Yes.
It's like, actually,
don't be negative about it.
Yeah. And if you're using negative language, then, that's, firstly, it's an indication of your own state of mind, but also it's like you're willing that to happen. It's not, I don't want it to happen. Of course I don't. But what we're looking at actually looks, to all intents and purposes, like the imminent collapse of a civilization, the imminent collapse of an empire. And when those things have happened, they've been generally painful, chaotic episodes. Yes, of course, after a while, something else emerges from the dust when it settles. The question is, if we get into a scenario where there's a nuclear exchange, there's no dust from us to emerge from, because everything's, well, it's not, there's no us to emerge from the dust because everything's dust, you know?
Yes.
And so I hate to sort of, as I say, sort of be thinking of ending on a negative, but it's just something that I just have to, I felt I had to say it, because it's all very well afterwards to say, I told you so.
Yeah, so I saw this coming.
But it's like, does nobody see what's going on? I think a lot of people do, but and maybe a lot of people are afraid to say anything. But it's just, we're across the ocean looking at it all, and looking at the craziness of people on the street with guns, and the potential for, you know, a huge eruption of violence there after the election and everything else. And it's like everybody wants to blame it on one individual, but actually what's happening is collective, you know? It's not like everybody's doing the same. It's not like Hitler's Germany, where he had almost eventually. But of course, it builds up over time. You know, the anger and the frustration builds up and builds up and builds up. And then what happens? It spills over into violence and conflict and disaster, actually. Disaster. It looks, to all intents and purposes, like America collectively is having a psychotic breakdown. And I just don't believe that can be good.
Again, getting back to what I said about the micro and the macro, America having a breakdown, it's the individual, again, getting back to kind of Jung, it's everyone individually is having a breakdown, and therefore the society as a whole is having a breakdown. So is the fix for America, you know, we can wax lyrical here, just chatting away about it, but is the fix for America that people start looking at themselves and their own lives and their own relationships? Does that have to happen, or can you do something more?
That has to happen, but how? I mean, I'm not sure, and maybe this is my failure to understand Jung fully, or maybe this is his failure, and I don't believe it's a failure, but his failure to give us the right tools for the job, as it were, is how you actually do it. Because to me, the personal development and growth that's needed is something that doesn't happen, as I said earlier on. You don't just suddenly wake up someday and say, oh, I'm going to be a good human being today.
Yes.
Especially if you're full of hatred and bile, and you've come to believe that the Mexicans are bad, or black people are bad, or this sort of stuff that's going on over there that's kind of driving people up the walls, you know. You don't suddenly wake up someday and snap out of it, you know. It's a long process. And I think that I think what I'm saying is it's too late for that now. I think we're on the verge in the next couple of years of something very, very a fairly substantial crisis that's going to affect a great deal of the humans on the planet.
Has COVID given us a bit of a reality check? I know it's intensified things in America, but leaving aside America,
I think it's kind of just added to the perfect storm of the whole thing, you know. Like, despite what some people might be saying, it's obvious that unemployment has risen dramatically, not just in the States, but in Europe as well, obviously. It's patently obvious. A load of people have been laid off work. And, you know, different countries have had different sort of methods for dealing with it. And it's quite obvious from looking from the outside that the States just decided, it's not going to be a problem. We're going to sweep it under the carpet.
Be grand.
You know, and it's not grand, you know. And pardon me, if that's their approach to this crisis, then how are they going to approach future crises? And the future crises will come. They're coming in the form of, for instance, wildfires and dramatic weather events.
Yeah, flooding.
They're coming in the form of disasters. And to me, the administration there isn't capable. It's shown itself incapable. And I'm not putting that square on the shoulders of one person. I believe that one person represents a much greater illness, a much deeper and greater problem. I hope, really earnestly hope, that I'm completely wrong.
Well, look, you can be, but I suppose that the main thing is that you're being honest.
It's just the way I see it right now, and
yeah.
I think I've been a rather sort of positive person in my life, and I've seen the positives and the negatives, and sometimes I've been very down about things and very anxious, and I think that feeds into my own sort of worldview, that sometimes it can be negative. Sometimes I'm looking for negative outcomes. This one, I've kind of been looking at it my whole life, because I became interested in that whole eschatology and end of world stuff when I was young, and it's something that moved me an awful lot and seemed to have a great influence on me, and it's entered into my writing. You'll see it in The Cry of the Segue, the boy that's trying to prevent the end of the world from happening. It's an event that has been foretold. It's an event that we can kind of, if we're honest, see coming, because we can't have this unhaltered growth and this economic development that we think is the panacea. The pollution of the earth and the seas and the air, climate change, which is a very real issue, the collapse of biodiversity. These things are all coming on top of each other. Are we seriously saying that we're suddenly going to, in a short time become enlightened as a movement of people, as an entire body of people living on the earth, that we're just going to suddenly turn around in the next 6 months and solve all these problems? I'd love if that were the case. And actually, the stupid thing is, I believe we can. I believe we have. Of course, I said it earlier. We have the wherewithal, we have the resources, we have the intelligence to solve all of the problems that we have. But will we?
It's in our hands, though, I think, isn't it? As individuals, do you know, that kind of way? Like if more of us, again, this is going to sound maybe very egotistical of me, but if more people were to be privy to maybe not this conversation, but conversations like it, if people were to maybe step outside themselves for 5 minutes and maybe get an appreciation for what it's like to be somebody else, because a big motivator for me having this platform is that I introduce people to other people who are in what I call different loops. So you're different because you're in half a dozen different loops. But
I'm a looper.
You're
Some people have said that about me.
Exactly,
That's okay.
Exactly. So you're a looper, but introducing people. So if somebody doesn't know anything about adventure racing or psychedelics or Irish mythology or any of the number of guests that I've had on, I think the more that we can have a window into other people's lives, the better chance we have of understanding that, we're not all the same and our differences are there to be kind of cherished. I suppose.
Yes. John Hume said that, by the way.
What was that he said?
John Hume. Well, he said our difference, everybody's born different. And he said that we should cherish our differences, and that's the only way we're going to get on.
Without a doubt,
he said that at the European Parliament, and he was a brilliant human being, and he exemplified that by showing it as a political leader.
Yes,
the willingness to reach out to people who were different, as in the Unionists and the Loyalists, and to reaching out to the Sinn Féin and the IRA and convincing them that they should be part of a dialogue towards peace. He was a brilliant, brilliant human being. We need loads of John Humes right now.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Desperately need them.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, I hope I'm wrong. You see, look, on the one hand, I could be here saying, Trump, I think he's great, which I don't. Okay, but it's, as I say, he is a symptom. He's not. People think he's the problem.
Oh, if we get rid of Trump, all our problems will be over.
No. Yeah. The problem is still there. On the other hand, I could sit comfortably on the fence and say nothing. But I do feel the need to say something. And I do feel the need that the people who I can see it. I can just see it. I can see it all unraveling. And it's unraveling quickly. The United States in the Obama era, and I don't think there's any president in the past century who has behaved in an exemplary fashion, or who you could hold up as they've all done nasty stuff, and they've all been involved in conflicts that they shouldn't have been involved in. But the America of 2015 is a very different America to the America of 2020. And if you look at it, it's just unraveling. Now, if someone can come along, a John Hume of American politics, to try and sort of bring them back from the brink, brilliant. I'm all for it. Bring them on quickly. We desperately need it, absolutely. But I couldn't sit here and not say it. It's just been on my mind actually lately. I just need to point out that a lot of people who are just apparently just saying nothing and just hoping that this is all going to go away.
Yeah,
you know, and perhaps their silence is only helping the situation to get worse.
Well, I don't know who I'm quoting, but it's relevant here. In order for evil to thrive, good men need do nothing.
Yeah, well, I don't particularly fancy getting involved in a conflict either. I'd rather just continue.
You are involved.
It's like I think back to Lord of the Rings. You know, it's like when Sam is trying to convince Frodo to go, let's just go home back to the Shire, and Frodo's like, you don't understand. if we don't act, there will be no Shire to go back to.
Yes.
And it's exactly that sort of stuff, of course. No matter what anybody tells you, if you've read Lord of the Rings, it is an analogy for the world wars of the 20th century, despite what Tolkien might have said in denial about that. It is absolutely an analogy for those wars. And that is the difficulty. I would desperately love for me just to continue in my little bubble here in Ireland and to continue living my comfortable existence and to do the things that I do. But I think everything that we are is threatened.
But
Everything.
I would see you as fighting against that by doing your Mythical Ireland stuff and doing your photography and being yourself and not conforming.
I don't see myself as a political activist, to be honest.
No,
you know.
But you're a political activist. You're a political activist almost by default, not intentionally, but there's so much poison and vitriol out there online, and I think you counteract a lot of that.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely aspect to it. Yeah, that's a fair kind of.
Nobody comes to Mythical Ireland to get enraged.
Well, some of them do. Like I have a video where I talk about the she power and what it means to be Irish, and I say that no matter how far you've come from, because like Irish history is that until the end of the Ice Age, there was nobody here. So all humans who are currently in Ireland are descended from somebody who arrived here from somewhere else.
Yes.
In other words, we're all immigrants.
Yes.
Right? And when I've said that, occasionally you get the racist nutters, banging on about how, I'm ashamed of the Irish race and this, that. I don't care about them. They can feck off so they can. I hate those. It's not that I hate them. I actually pity those deranged nutters who think that for somehow just ignoring the history of our island, that we've suddenly arrived at some magic pure Irish racial identity.
Yes.
It's nonsense. I said it recently. You could get a DNA test done tomorrow, as could I. We could both find that there's English, Viking, Bronze Age. We might have a touch of Mesolithic and Neolithic in us. We might find that there's German blood somewhere in us. Who knows what would turn up, right? It's nonsense. This racism thing is absolute nonsense. You pare it back to its basics. We're all human and we all breathe the same air.
No, absolutely.
And you can't divvy that up.
But even in you're dealing with that person, you don't strike me as somebody who will just, go F yourself and block them. Depending on how bad it is, obviously. But
in fairness,
you're not fueling the flames.
With the trolls who are nasty and who are clearly not going to engage in intellectual discourse, I just block them.
Well, but even that in itself.
Before they get a chance to get started, I just delete the comment and block them.
But in the interest of clicks and in the interest of views and in promoting your business, there's the whole wellspring of views and new people that you could attract by getting into it with these people and stirring the pot and creating controversy.
I'm very fond of having what you would call intellectual debate. I like being debated when the subject is being debated and not the man.
Yes, absolutely. When it's the ideas and not the person.
And I love actually the fact that in my exploration of Neolithic Ireland and prehistoric Ireland, and especially in the terms of mythology, I love the fact that in my work I have never ever tried to declare that this is the solution, this is the answer. Nobody else has reached this conclusion except me. It's bullshit. If you're at that phase, then you've got a problem with your ego. The fact of the matter is that for every question I have asked about the past, it opens up several more questions. I don't claim to have the answers, and I don't believe we ever will have a lot of the answers. But the exploration is fascinating all the same. And I would apply the same to discourse in general. If somebody comes on and says, and they're willing to debate it. If somebody comes on and says, the Irish, we should protect the Irish and don't let these immigrants. I would say, well, hang on a second, we're all immigrants. And they'd say, what are you talking about? Try to educate them. Say, well, actually, at the end of the Ice Age, there was nobody here. No humans.
Yeah, we all came from
the first humans came either from Scotland or the Isle of Man in the Mesolithic. So essentially the Irish are British. How do you answer that? I think we had that discussion on one of our podcasts
I think we did
before.
Too, yeah. But worth remembering.
It will either enrage them or they'll see sense. They usually get enraged and go away. But, a lot of people at the moment, as you know, are trying to deny the evidence, and that's a big part of the problem in the Western world now, is that we believe what we read on Facebook, but we don't want to read the texts, the history texts, the science textbooks. And I'm not saying for a second that my work is entirely scientific. It's got a lot of esoteric stuff in it, but I never try. Excuse me. I never try to turn over the science and say it's the science. Don't just ignore the science,
Yes.
because it's nonsense. I always build it on the foundation that the science is accurate and, well, subject to future change in the case of the DNA, etc. But I'll debate them if they're willing to debate.
Yes.
But if it just turns into mudslinging, where does that end up? And that's the big part of the problem right now. That's what's wrong in the States and in Britain and in other places. And we have an element of it here, a growing element of it in Irish society. Anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers and flat earthers. I mean, they're wrong. They're just wrong. And rational and scientifically minded people know they're wrong. But in their minds, no, we're not wrong. The worst thing is, not only do they not think they're wrong, they're bloody angry too. Yeah. And that's a lethal combination. Ignorance and anger. Ignorance and anger have led to an awful lot of people getting killed.
No, without a doubt.
I sincerely hope, and I'll stop boring your listeners now, but I genuinely do, hand on heart, genuinely hope that I'm drastically wrong in that pessimistic scenario that I've just painted.
Well, look, whether you're right or wrong, from my view, you're doing more than any other person I can really name, being perfectly frank with you, insofar as you're following your bliss. As Joseph Campbell said, you're doing what you like to do. You've a good connection with your family. You're reconnecting with them more and more. You're on this platform and your own and others promoting what you do and how you do it, and encouraging presumably other people to follow their bliss and get involved and to make a difference and to make the world a slightly better place, as opposed to the mudslinging that goes on. And
well, in studying the past, the biggest thing is that you hope you learn the lessons of it.
Yes,
you hope not to repeat those painful lessons.
Well, I mean, if Newgrange is anything, it should be a shining example to us all that you can have something and then it can be just wiped out.
Well, and you have exactly taken the words out of my mouth, because that's what I would have sort of finished by saying, is that there is evidence now of a vast complex of monuments there that was clearly built by a very organised society of people, and they suffered some sort of a catastrophe because the Bronze Age people came in and took over. And so you'll hear some sort of very happy people celebrating the ancestors and talking about their ancestors. They're not their ancestors. They're actually people who lived and died and pretty much vanished from the scene because they were taken over by events. Don't let that be our story.
Absolutely, yeah.
Don't let that be our story. I've said in the Cry of the Sebok that there was the potential for that we will be remembered in thousands of years to come when humanity has built up again after this disaster, if it happens, and I say that if with great hope that it doesn't, that we'll be remembered as the ones who went to the moon. That'll be the biggest myth about our time, will be.
Yeah, it did.
Those people went to the moon, but they couldn't live together.
Yeah.
They built weapons that were capable of wiping out large portions of the population of the Earth and causing huge environmental catastrophe. They sent people to the moon. They were brilliant enough to do that, but they couldn't just learn to shake hands and say, listen, my brother, I know you're Muslim, I know you're black, I know you're Chinese, I know you're Mexican, I know you're Irish. I just want you to know we're breathing the same air here, brother or sister, whoever you happen to be. And let's just try and get on and acknowledge our differences.
Without a doubt, the human experience is exactly that. The human experience. It's not the white human experience and the black human experience. We're all one, basically. We're all brothers and sisters on this pale
yes,
blue
but
dot.
we're all entirely unique.
Yeah. Anthony, before I let you go, I'm going to ask you for the website address and how people find some of your work. Name your books, where you can get them.
Very easy to find me, because you just look for Mythical Ireland. So it's mythicalireland.com or mythicalireland.ie is the website. Facebook.com/Mythical Ireland. I'm on Twitter and I'm on Instagram, although I just share the pictures there and links to videos on YouTube on Twitter. YouTube is Mythical Ireland. And all the books that I've mentioned today, Island of the Setting Sun, has just been reprinted. I'm going either today or tomorrow to collect copies. You can buy that signed copy on mythicalireland.com. You can buy my book Mythical Ireland, New Light in the Ancient Past. You can buy Dronehenge, the story behind the remarkable discovery at Newgrange, which you have a copy of there behind you. And you can buy Newgrange Monument to Immortality, not forgetting my novel, The Cry of the Sebok. And I'm still writing, so...
Well, yeah. I hope you continue to keep writing. I hope you continue to keep doing your podcasts and the whole Mythical Ireland thing. I wish you the best of luck in everything that you do. And one of these days, when you come back and talk to me again, you're going to tell me about Morse code and ham radio and brass bands. Because we still have.
I actually would be genuinely delighted to talk to you about those things. Yeah.
Fantastic. No, brilliant. We'll pencil it in for the not too distant future.
Brilliant.
Anthony, it's
been great fun.
It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. We'll have you on again, no doubt.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Fran. Thanks for inviting me back.
Thank you. But before I let you go, I'd just like to remind everybody that this episode and all the episodes on YouTube have been brought to you by past guests and friend of the show,